There are moments in history when the impossible becomes real, when numbers lose their meaning, when the laws of war bend beneath the weight of human will. This is the story of one of those moments. In the summer of 480 BCE, the largest army the world had ever seen marched toward Greece. It moved like a living entity, a serpent of bronze and flesh stretching across the landscape for miles. The Persians called it the army of the great king. The Greeks called it the end of everything they knew. At its head rode Xerxes, king of kings, ruler of an empire that spanned 3 continents. Behind him marched warriors from 46 nations, Persians and Medes, Bactrians and Indians, Ethiopians with stone-tipped arrows, Arabians wrapped in flowing robes, Thracians carrying foxskin caps and javelins. Each contingent wore the armor and carried the weapons of their homeland. Each brought their own gods and their own reasons for war. Ancient historians claimed the Persian host numbered in the millions. Modern scholars are more conservative, but even the most careful estimates place Xerxes' invasion force at somewhere between 150,000 and 300,000 men. The true number will never be known. What matters is that everyone who saw it believed they were witnessing something unprecedented, something unstoppable. The Greek historian Herodotus wrote that when the Persians fired their arrows, they darkened the sun, that when they drank from rivers, those rivers ran dry, that the sound of their march could be heard for miles, a low thunder that never ceased. He wrote these things not because they were literally true, but because they captured something essential about the terror this army inspired. This was not merely a military force, it was a statement, a demonstration of imperial power so overwhelming that resistance seemed not just futile, but absurd. And yet, in a narrow pass between mountain and sea, that resistance came. 300 Spartan warriors stood in the path of this multitude. Around them clustered perhaps 7,000 other Greeks, drawn from cities and towns across Hellas. Together, they occupied a strip of land no more than 50 feet wide at its narrowest point. Behind them stretched the only road the Persians could take. Before them gathered the might of the known world. For 3 days, they held. The story of Thermopylae has been told countless times. It has been shaped by poets and propagandists, by artists and filmmakers, until the historical truth has become difficult to separate from legend. Some versions present the Spartans as superhuman warriors, almost magical in their prowess. Others reduce the battle to simple geography, as though terrain alone explains what happened in that pass. The truth is more complex, more human, and far more remarkable. This is not a story about invincibility. It is a story about choice, about men who understood they were going to die and marched forward. Anyway, about a defensive stand so effective that it bought Greece the time it needed to survive. About how a handful of warriors, through discipline and tactical brilliance and sheer stubborn defiance, proved that numbers are not everything. To understand what happened at Thermopylae, we must first understand what it meant to be Spartan. We must understand the military revolution that made hoplite warfare possible. We must grasp the strategic situation that made this pass so crucial, and we must see both the Persians and the Greeks as they saw themselves, not as characters in a legend, but as men facing impossible choices in a world where the stakes were absolute. The Battle of Thermopylae lasted 3 days. Its consequences echoed for centuries. This is how it happened. Sparta, before Thermopylae. To understand why 300 Spartans could hold a pass against an army, you must first understand what a Spartan was. They were not born, they were forged. Sparta was not like other Greek cities. While Athens celebrated philosophy and art, Sparta celebrated only war. While other city-states valued commerce and culture, Sparta valued obedience and strength. The entire Spartan social order existed for one purpose: to produce the finest infantry soldiers in the world. Everything else was subordinate to this goal. The process began at birth. When a child was born in Sparta, he was not automatically accepted into the community. Instead, he was brought before the elders, the Gerousia, who examined him carefully. They looked for deformities, Weakness, any sign that the child might not become a strong warrior. If the infant failed this inspection, he was taken to the Apothetai, a chasm at the base of Mount Taygetus, and left to die. This seems brutal to modern sensibilities. It was brutal, but Sparta was a city perpetually at war, surrounded by enemies and vastly outnumbered by the population it controlled. The Spartans, the Spartiates, numbered perhaps 8 to 10,000 adult males at their peak. They ruled over tens of thousands of helots, state-owned serfs who worked the land and lived in constant subjugation. The helots outnumbered their masters by perhaps 7 to 1. Rebellion was not a theoretical threat. It was an ever-present danger that shaped every aspect of Spartan society. In this context, weakness was not just a personal failing. It was an existential threat to the entire community. If a male child passed the initial inspection, he remained with his mother until age 7. These early years represented the only time in a Spartan boy's life when he would know anything resembling a normal childhood. He played. He learned to speak. He began to understand what it meant to be Spartan. At 7, everything changed. The boy was taken from his home and entered the agoge, the brutal state education system that would dominate the next 13 years of his life. He would not return to live with his family. From this moment forward, the state owned him completely. The agoge was not a school in any conventional sense. It was a machine designed to break boys down and rebuild them as warriors. The Spartan education system had one goal: to produce men who would never retreat, never surrender, and never break formation no matter what horrors they faced. Physical training was constant and severe. Boys ran for miles every day, building the endurance that would later allow Spartan armies to march faster and farther than their enemies expected. They wrestled and boxed, learning to fight with their hands and to endure pain. They trained with weapons from an early age, first with wooden practice weapons, then with actual spears and shields as they grew older. But the physical training was only part of the process. The agoge also employed deliberate deprivation and hardship. Boys in the agoge were kept perpetually hungry. They were given enough food to survive, but never enough to feel satisfied. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was training. The Spartans believed that hunger taught resourcefulness and endurance. A boy who could function while hungry would not collapse when supply lines failed during a campaign. To supplement their meager rations, boys were expected to steal food, but if they were caught, they were beaten severely, not for stealing, which was considered clever, but for the incompetence of being caught. The lesson was clear: in war, you must take what you need from the enemy, but you must do so effectively. Failure has consequences. They slept in communal barracks on thin reed mats, without blankets even in winter. They were given only one garment to wear year-round. They bathed infrequently in cold water. Every comfort was stripped away, every weakness exposed and hammered out. The boys were organized into herds, or egoli, and each herd was supervised by an older boy selected for his intelligence and ferocity. These young leaders had the authority to discipline the younger boys, and they used it. The boys fought each other constantly, sometimes in organized competitions, sometimes in spontaneous brawls. Violence was not discouraged, it was encouraged. The Spartans believed that boys needed to learn to fight the way a blacksmith learns to forge metal, through constant practice and exposure to hardship. But the agoge trained more than bodies. It trained minds and spirits. Spartan boys were taught to speak with precision and economy. The region of Laconia, where Sparta was located, gave rise to the word laconic, meaning brief and to the point. A Spartan was expected to convey maximum meaning with minimum words. Long speeches were seen as a sign of weakness, evidence that a man lacked the confidence to speak plainly. There is a famous anecdote, perhaps apocryphal but nonetheless illustrative, about Spartan speech. Philip II of Macedon, father of Alexander the Great, sent a message to Sparta: "If I invade Laconia, I will destroy your city to the ground." The Spartans sent back a single word: "if." Philip never invaded. This economy of language extended to the battlefield. Spartan commanders did not give lengthy motivational speeches before battle. They did not need to. Every man knew his duty and would perform it without needing to be convinced. The boys were also taught to endure insult and pain without reaction. A Spartan who lost his temper had lost control, and a warrior who cannot control himself cannot be trusted in formation. They learned to master fear, not by eliminating it, fear is a natural human response, but by functioning despite it. Courage, to the Spartans, was not the absence of fear. It was the decision to advance even when fear screamed at you to run. Religion permeated every aspect of Spartan life, but their religion was not the elaborate mythology found in other Greek cities. Spartan religion was martial and practical. They worshipped gods of war and discipline. Before battle, Spartan armies made sacrifices and consulted omens with absolute seriousness. If the omens were unfavorable, they would delay an attack, even if it meant giving up tactical advantage. This was not superstition in the modern sense. It was a system of psychological preparation, a way to ensure that the men went into battle believing the gods supported them. At age 12, boys entered a new phase of the agoge. They were taken to the crypteia, a secret ritual that marked their transition toward adulthood. Little is known about the details of the crypteia, as it was kept secret from outsiders, but what we do know is disturbing. Selected boys were sent out into the countryside at night, armed only with a knife. Their mission was to hunt and kill helots, the enslaved population that served Sparta. This was not combat training in the conventional sense. The helots were unarmed civilians. The purpose was different. It was about teaching Spartan boys to kill without hesitation, to see the helots not as human beings, but as potential threats that must be preemptively eliminated. This practice reveals the dark foundation of Spartan society. Their military excellence was built upon terror and oppression. The Spartans were not philosopher warriors fighting for noble ideals. They were an occupying military force maintaining control through fear. Every Spartan male understood that if he showed weakness, if the military system failed, the helot population would rise up and slaughter every Spartiate man, woman, and child. This knowledge produced a society of unparalleled military effectiveness, but also one of rigid cruelty. At 20, a Spartan male completed the agoge and became eligible for citizenship. But this did not mean his training ended. He now joined a syssitia, a military mess where he would eat communal meals with his fellow warriors for the rest of his life. These meals were notoriously terrible. Black broth made from pork, vinegar, and blood was the signature Spartan dish, a food so unpalatable that a foreign visitor once remarked that after tasting it, he understood why Spartans were so willing to die in battle. But the meals were not about cuisine, they were about bonding. Spartans ate together, trained together, and fought together. They formed bonds stronger than family ties. When a Spartan went into battle, he fought not for abstract concepts like freedom or glory, but for the men standing beside him. He fought because he would rather die than shame himself before his brothers. At 30, if a Spartan had demonstrated sufficient excellence and had been elected to a syssitia by its existing members, he became a full citizen with the right to attend the assembly. But even then, his military obligations continued. Spartan men remained on active duty until age 60. For 50 years, war defined their existence. Women in Sparta occupied a unique position in the Greek world. Unlike in Athens, where women were largely confined to the household, Spartan women enjoyed considerable freedom and authority. They owned property. They managed estates while their husbands were away at war. They exercised publicly and participated in athletic competitions. This was not because Spartans believed in gender equality as a philosophical principle. It was pragmatic. Spartan women needed to be strong and healthy to produce strong children. They needed to be capable of managing complex economic affairs because Spartan men were often absent on campaigns. And they needed to internalize the same values of discipline and sacrifice that defined Spartan men. Spartan mothers were expected to raise their sons to be warriors and to accept their deaths without visible emotion. There is a famous story, again perhaps apocryphal, of a Spartan mother who, upon hearing that her son had died in battle, asked only, "Did he keep his place in the formation?" When told that he had, she replied, "Then I am satisfied." The shield was central to Spartan identity. A Spartan hoplite carried a large, round shield, called a hoplon or aspis, made of wood covered with bronze. It measured roughly 3 feet in diameter and weighed 15 to 20 pounds. Unlike shields used by other armies, the aspis was designed not primarily for individual protection, but for collective defense. When Spartans formed their phalanx, each man's shield protected not only himself, but the man to his left. The right side of each warrior's body was protected by the shield of the man beside him. This created a wall of overlapping bronze that was extraordinarily difficult to break, but it also meant that if any man turned and ran, he exposed the entire formation to danger. This is why the greatest shame for a Spartan was to return from battle without his shield. If a warrior returned without his spear or helmet, it meant he had been disarmed in honest combat. But if he returned without his shield, it meant he had thrown it away to run faster. It meant he had abandoned his comrades. The phrase, "Come back with your shield or on it," was not a poetic flourish. It was a literal command. A Spartan either returned victorious or dead. There was no third option. The phalanx formation was revolutionary in its time. Before hoplite warfare emerged, battles were often chaotic affairs dominated by individual champions. Armies were loose collections of warriors who fought as much for personal glory as for victory. The phalanx changed this. It made warfare about discipline and cohesion rather than individual heroics. A proper phalanx consisted of ranks of men standing shoulder to shoulder, usually 8 rows deep, though Spartans sometimes formed deeper or shallower, depending on circumstances. The front rank held their spears overhand, thrusting forward at enemy faces and throats. The second rank also held spears, stabbing over the shoulders of the men in front. The rear ranks could not effectively use their spears in combat, but their presence provided physical and psychological weight to the formation. They pushed forward, keeping pressure on the men in front, preventing any backward movement. In the phalanx, individual excellence meant nothing without collective coordination. A great warrior fighting alone would be overwhelmed, but average warriors fighting together in perfect formation became nearly invincible. The Spartans understood this better than anyone. Their training emphasized not individual combat skills, but synchronized movement and iron discipline. They drilled constantly, practicing the complex maneuvers needed to maintain formation while advancing, retreating, or pivoting to face attacks from different directions. Other Greek armies trained periodically when war threatened or during annual festivals. Spartan warriors trained every single day of their adult lives. This gave them an edge that numbers could not overcome. When a Spartan phalanx moved, it moved as one entity. When it struck, every spear found its mark in the same instant. When it held ground, it held absolutely. But Spartan military supremacy rested on one more foundation: their freedom from economic concerns. Spartan citizens did not farm, trade, or work in any conventional sense. That labor was performed by helots. This allowed Spartans to focus exclusively on warfare. While other Greek cities had to balance military training with economic activity, Spartans could dedicate every day to becoming better soldiers. This system was deeply unjust. It depended on the brutal exploitation of an enslaved population, but it produced soldiers of unmatched quality. By 480 BCE, Sparta had been perfecting this system for generations. Their reputation was established. When Greek cities needed military help, they called on Sparta. When armies faced each other in the field, the presence of Spartan troops often decided the outcome before fighting began. Enemies knew that Spartans would not break, would not retreat, would fight until they won or until they died. This reputation was about to be tested in the most extreme circumstances imaginable. The 300 men who would march to Thermopylae were not special even by Spartan standards. They were not an elite guard or a hand-picked unit of champions. They were simply Spartans. Each had survived the agoge. Each had proven himself in battle. Each had sons to carry on his lineage, ensuring that his death would not end his family line. They had spent their entire lives preparing for the moment when they would be asked to stand against impossible odds. They had been taught since childhood that death in battle was not something to fear, but something to embrace. They had internalized the understanding that glory came not from survival, but from keeping your place in the line. When King Leonidas selected these men, he did not need to explain the mission. He did not need to motivate them or convince them. He simply pointed to the mountain pass and said, "In effect, this is where we will hold." And they understood. They picked up their shields. They sharpened their spears. They kissed their wives and children farewell. And they marched north toward Thermopylae, toward the hot gates, toward the place where they would write their names into history, with blood and bronze and absolute defiance. They marched toward the impossible, and they went willingly. Why Thermopylae mattered. Greece was not a country. It was an idea, a collection of independent city-states bound by common language, shared gods, and mutual suspicion. These cities, Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, and hundreds of smaller poleis, spent as much time fighting each other as they did cooperating. They had different governments, different laws, different priorities. When the Persian Empire came for them, this disunity nearly destroyed them. The Persian invasion of 480 BCE was not the first time the Greeks had faced this threat. 10 years earlier, in 490 BCE, King Darius, father of Xerxes, had sent a massive expeditionary force across the Aegean Sea. That force landed at Marathon, 26 miles from Athens. Against all expectations, the Athenian army, supported by a small Plataean contingent but fighting essentially alone, smashed the Persian force in a single desperate battle. The victory at Marathon stunned the Greek world. It proved that Persian soldiers, despite their vast numbers and their empire's terrifying reputation, could be defeated by disciplined Greek hoplites, but it also ensured that Persia would return. Darius began preparing an even larger invasion, one that would crush Greece completely. His death in 486 BCE delayed the plan, but did not end it. His son Xerxes inherited both the throne and the burning desire to avenge Persian honor. For the Greeks who paid attention to foreign intelligence, the warning signs were unmistakable. Reports reached Greece of massive preparations, shipyards working day and night across the Persian Empire, vast stockpiles of grain being assembled, roads being built through hostile territory, bridges being constructed to span rivers that had never been crossed by armies. Xerxes was not planning a raid. He was planning conquest. When the Persian army finally began its march in 480 BCE, the Greek city-states faced an existential crisis. Some chose to submit immediately, offering earth and water, the traditional symbols of submission, to Persian heralds. These cities hoped that by surrendering early, they might preserve their wealth and status as subjects of the Persian Empire. Other cities wanted to resist, but had no idea how to coordinate an effective defense. A few cities, led by Athens and Sparta, determined to fight regardless of the odds. The strategic problem was immense. The Persian army was approaching from the north, marching down through Macedon and Thessaly. To reach the population centers of central and southern Greece, places like Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and Thebes, the Persians would need to traverse difficult terrain. Mountains dominated the Greek landscape. The Pindus Range ran down the spine of the mainland like a backbone. Travel was channeled into narrow passes and coastal roads, where large armies had to compress into columns. This geography offered the Greeks their only realistic chance. They could not match Persian numbers in open battle. Even if every Greek city contributed troops, the combined Greek army would be outnumbered at least 2-1, probably more. But they did not need to win a pitched battle. They needed to slow the Persian advance, to buy time, to demonstrate that conquering Greece would be expensive and difficult. The key was finding the right defensive position. It had to be narrow enough that Greek forces could hold it despite being outnumbered. It had to be on the route the Persians would take, leaving them no easy alternative. And it had to be defensible long enough to matter. Several options existed, but each had problems. The Vale of Tempe, far to the north in Thessaly, was narrow and defensible, but it had alternate routes around it. An army could bypass Tempe entirely by taking mountain paths. Defending it would achieve nothing. Further south, the Isthmus of Corinth offered a strong position. The isthmus was only a few miles wide, and walls already existed there from previous conflicts. Defending the isthmus would protect the Peloponnese, the southern peninsula, where Sparta and several other major cities were located. But it would also abandon Athens and all of central Greece to the Persians. The Athenians, understandably, rejected this option. If the other Greeks retreated to the isthmus, Athens would fight alone or submit. The Athenians had another reason to demand a forward defense. Their city was only 40 miles from the sea. If the Persian fleet controlled the waters around Athens, the city could be surrounded and starved into submission, even if its army remained intact. The only way to protect Athens was to prevent the Persian navy from reaching southern waters. This meant holding the Persians on land while simultaneously contesting control of the sea. Between the northern plains of Thessaly and the central plains around Athens, the main road south passed through a narrow coastal strip called Thermopylae, the Hot Gates. The name came from the warm sulfur springs that bubbled up in the area, creating a landscape of mineral-stained rocks and strange, noxious vapors. At Thermopylae, the road compressed between the sea to the east and steep mountains to the west. The width varied along its length, but at its narrowest point, the passage was barely 50 feet wide. Some ancient sources say only 15 feet, though this may be an exaggeration. To be clear, the geography has changed significantly over 2.5 millennia. The sea level was higher in 480 BCE than it is today, and subsequent earthquakes and sediment deposition have altered the coastline. In ancient times, the sea came right up to the base of the mountains, creating a choke point even more compressed than what exists in the modern landscape. An army marching through Thermopylae could not deploy into battle formation. It had to pass through the narrows in column, then reform on the other side. This made the pass almost impossible to force through direct assault. Any attacking army, no matter how large, could only bring a small fraction of its strength to bear at any given moment. The rest would be stacked up behind, waiting for their turn to die. Moreover, at the narrowest point, there was an ancient wall, the Phocian Wall, built long ago by the people of Phocis to defend against invasions from the north. The wall had fallen into disrepair, but its foundations remained, and it could be rebuilt quickly. This meant the defenders would not have to hold open ground. They could fight from behind stone fortifications, forcing attackers to climb over rubble while being stabbed by spears from above. But Thermopylae had a critical weakness. A mountain path, called the Anapaya, wound through the hills to the west of the pass. This path was steep and difficult, not suitable for large forces or cavalry, but a determined infantry column could use it to bypass the main gates entirely. Anyone holding Thermopylae had to guard this path as well, or they would be surrounded and destroyed. When the Greek leaders met to discuss strategy in the late summer of 480 BCE, Thermopylae emerged as the obvious choice. It was narrow enough to hold. It was on the direct route south, and its location corresponded to a natural defensive position at sea, the straits between the island of Euboea and the mainland, where the Greek fleet could contest Persian naval superiority in confined waters. The plan was simple in concept, but extraordinarily difficult in execution. A small Greek force would occupy Thermopylae and hold the pass for as long as possible. Simultaneously, the Greek fleet, composed primarily of Athenian triremes, would engage the Persian navy in the straits. If both forces could hold their positions, the Persian advance would stall. The Persians would be forced to find an alternative route or to batter themselves against Greek defenses until their morale broke. This was not a plan for victory, it was a plan for survival. The Greeks holding Thermopylae would be vastly outnumbered. They would be cut off from reinforcement. They would face the finest soldiers of the Persian Empire, including the elite immortals, the personal guard of the great king. Everyone understood that the defenders would eventually be overwhelmed, but if they could hold for even a few days, they would accomplish several critical objectives. They would inflict casualties on the Persians, reducing the enemy's overwhelming numerical advantage. They would demonstrate Greek resolve, showing both the Persians and the wavering Greek cities that resistance was possible. They would buy time for the Greek fleet to engage the Persian navy, potentially crippling the invasion's logistics, and they would allow the cities of southern Greece to prepare their defenses for the next phase of the war. The Greeks needed someone to command this desperate defense. The choice was obvious. Sparta provided the finest infantry in Greece. Spartan leadership would legitimize the operation and ensure that the troops fought with maximum effectiveness. But which Spartan would command? Sparta had two kings, an unusual system that dated back to the city's founding. One king would typically remain home, while the other led military campaigns. In 480 BCE, the two kings were Leonidas and Leotychidas. Custom and politics pointed to Leonidas as the natural choice to command at Thermopylae. Leonidas was approximately 60 years old, an advanced age for a field commander in the ancient world. He had become king only a few years earlier, after his half-brother Cleomenes died in mysterious circumstances. Leonidas had not expected to be king. He was a younger son who should have lived out his life as an elite warrior, but nothing more. Yet fate and family tragedy had placed him on one of Sparta's two thrones. Despite his age, Leonidas was a formidable warrior. He had survived the agoge. He had fought in dozens of battles. He understood phalanx warfare at an instinctive level, the way a craftsman understands his tools. More importantly, he understood Spartans. He knew how to lead men who had been trained since childhood to obey without question. He knew when to push and when to hold back. He knew that Spartan warriors did not need emotional speeches or elaborate motivation. They needed clear orders and the confidence that their commander would not waste their lives carelessly. Leonidas was not the type of leader who inspired through charisma or oratory. He inspired through competence and example. When he told his men to advance into danger, they advanced because they knew he would be at the front of the formation, not commanding from safety in the rear. When the call went out for troops to march to Thermopylae, politics intervened. The Olympic Games were approaching, and religious law forbade Spartans from marching to war during this sacred period. Additionally, the Carnea festival, honoring Apollo, would occupy Sparta's attention for several more days. These religious obligations were taken with absolute seriousness. To march in violation of them would anger the gods and bring disaster. But waiting for the festivals to end meant the Persians would already be through Thermopylae. The pass would be lost, and with it, any hope of defending central Greece. The Spartans faced an impossible choice: break religious law or abandon their allies. They found a compromise. Leonidas would take a small advance force north immediately, officially as a royal guard rather than a full army. This force would hold Thermopylae until the festivals ended, at which point the full Spartan army would march north to relieve them. In theory, Leonidas was buying time for the main force to arrive. In practice, everyone understood the real situation. 300 Spartans, no matter how skilled, could not hold Thermopylae indefinitely against the entire Persian army. Leonidas was marching to his death, and the religious excuse was simply political cover for a suicide mission. Leonidas selected his 300 men according to specific criteria. Each had to have living sons. This ensured that their family lines would continue after their deaths. Sparta could not afford to lose entire bloodlines. The city's population of full citizens was already dangerously low. Every Spartan death represented not just the loss of a warrior, but a permanent reduction in the breeding population that sustained the military system. These 300 were not young men seeking glory. They were mature warriors, most in their 30s and 40s, veterans of multiple campaigns. They had proven themselves in battle. They knew what they were doing, and they understood exactly what would happen at Thermopylae. When Leonidas and his 300 departed Sparta, they were accompanied by helots, state slaves who served as personal attendants to Spartan warriors. Ancient sources do not give a precise number, but likely several hundred helots marched north, carrying supplies, tending to wounded and performing the logistical tasks that kept the Spartans fed and equipped. These helots would also fight at Thermopylae, though history has largely forgotten them. They died alongside their masters in the pass, unnamed and unremembered. As Leonidas marched north, other Greek cities contributed troops to the defense. The Thespians sent 700 hoplites, a significant portion of their available military strength. The Thebans, whose loyalty to the Greek cause was questionable, sent 400 men. The Artemi cities of the Peloponnese contributed several thousand more. By the time the Greek force assembled at Thermopylae, it numbered somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 men. This was not a large army. It was barely a decent-sized garrison, but it was enough to hold the pass if the men fought with perfect discipline and if their commanders used the terrain intelligently. Leonidas did not rush to Thermopylae. He marched deliberately, gathering allies as he went, allowing word of his approach to spread. He wanted the Persians to know the pass was defended. He wanted Xerxes to understand that this invasion would not be a simple matter of marching south and accepting surrender. Every day Leonidas delayed the Persian advance was a day for Athens to evacuate its population, a day for the Greek fleet to prepare, a day for the southern cities to build their defenses. When Leonidas finally reached Thermopylae, his men set to work immediately. They rebuilt the Phocian wall, piling stones into Tokar, a defensive barrier that blocked the narrowest part of the pass. They established watchposts on the mountain slopes to guard against flanking movements. They scouted the Anapaya path and stationed 1,000 Phocian troops there to prevent the Persians from using it to bypass the main position. They prepared the ground for battle. They cleared rocks and debris that might trip advancing soldiers. They marked distances so that every man would know exactly how far enemy formations would need to advance before coming into spear range. They practiced moving in and out of their defensive position, ensuring that fresh troops could relieve exhausted ones without creating gaps in the line. And then they waited. The pass at Thermopylae was an ugly place. The hot springs created a constant sulphurous stench. The ground was rocky and uneven. Summer heat reflected off the cliff faces and pressed down on the narrow coastal strip. There was no shade, no comfort, no beauty. It was a place where nothing could grow except the mold that thrived in the warm, mineral-rich water. It was the perfect place for a last stand. Across the mountains to the north, the Persian army approached. They had been marching for months, crossing the Hellespont on bridges of boats, traversing Thrace and Macedon, accepting the surrender of northern Greek cities. They had encountered no significant resistance. City after city had submitted. The march had become almost ceremonial, a grand procession of the great king through lands that acknowledged his supremacy. As far as Xerxes knew, the Greeks were broken and divided. They would surrender or be crushed. The campaign was nearly over. He had no idea that in the narrow pass ahead, 300 Spartans were waiting for him. 300 men who had been trained since childhood for this exact moment. 300 men who would not move. 300 men who would prove that empires can bleed. The march of Xerxes, the Persian army moved like the Persian, a force of nature. It did not hurry. It did not need to. When you command the largest military force ever assembled, speed is unnecessary. Inevitability is enough. Xerxes had been planning this invasion for years. After his father Darius died in 486 BCE, Xerxes spent the first years of his reign consolidating power and crushing revolts in Egypt and Babylon. But the humiliation of Marathon, the defeat of a Persian army by the Greeks, gnawed at him constantly. It was not just a military setback, it was an insult to Persian honor, to the dignity of the great king himself. As long as Greece remained free, Persia's reputation was tarnished. So Xerxes planned. Not a raid this time, not an expeditionary force, but total conquest. He would bring such overwhelming force that resistance would be meaningless. He would demonstrate to the entire world what it meant to defy the King of Kings. The preparations were staggering in scale. Herodotus claims that Xerxes spent 4 years assembling his invasion force, gathering troops from every corner of his empire. Modern historians are skeptical of some of Herodotus's details, but the basic picture is clear. This was an unprecedented mobilization. The Persian Empire in 480 BCE was the largest political entity the world had ever seen. It stretched from the Indus River in the east to Egypt in the south to the borders of Greece in the west. It encompassed dozens of distinct ethnic groups, each with their own language, culture, and military tradition. Xerxes did not merely levy troops from this empire. He turned the invasion of Greece into a demonstration of Persian diversity and power. The core of the Persian army consisted of Persian and Median soldiers, the empire's traditional military elite. These men wore scale armor made of bronze or iron plates sewn onto leather backing. They carried short swords, kalekinakes, and fought with bows and spears. Persian archers were particularly feared. They had trained since childhood and could shoot accurately at ranges that left Greek hoplites defenseless. But the Persians understood that archery alone could not break a Greek phalanx. They needed heavy infantry capable of fighting at close quarters. For this, they relied on troops from across the empire. Bactrians brought composite bows and fought in their distinctive reed-shaft arrows. Indians wore cotton clothing and carried cane bows that shot iron-tipped arrows. Ethiopians wore leopard and lion skins and carried stone-tipped arrows and spears. Thracians brought javelins and small wicker shields. Each nation's contingent fought in their own style with their own equipment. This diversity was intentional. Xerxes wanted his enemies to see the sheer breadth of his empire, the impossibility of resisting a power that could draw on so many peoples and resources. When the Persians arrayed for battle, the spectacle alone was meant to terrify. 46 nations standing together under the banner of the great king. But this diversity also created problems. These troops did not train together. They did not speak the same language. They used different tactics and had different levels of discipline. Coordinating them required enormous logistical and command capabilities. Persian generals had to issue orders through multiple layers of interpreters, hoping that commands would be transmitted accurately and executed uniformly. In practice, this meant that Persian armies, despite their vast size, were less tactically flexible than smaller, more homogeneous forces. The elite core of the Persian military was the Immortals, 10,000 hand-picked warriors who served as the great king's personal guard and shock troops. They were called Immortals because their number never changed. If a man died or became too injured to fight, he was immediately replaced, maintaining the unit at exactly 10,000 men. This created the impression of an unkillable force, a unit that could not be depleted no matter how many men fell. The Immortals wore elaborate uniforms, long robes, golden jewelry, scale armor. They carried spears and bows and fought with a discipline that matched any troops in the world. Unlike the levies from distant provinces, the Immortals trained constantly and fought as a cohesive unit. When diplomatic intimidation failed, when lesser troops could not achieve an objective, the great king sent the Immortals. They had never been defeated in battle. Their reputation alone was often enough to break enemy morale before combat even began. The Persian fleet was equally impressive. Xerxes commanded somewhere between 600 and 1,200 warships, mostly triremes provided by the Phoenicians, Egyptians, and Ionian Greeks who were subjects of the empire. These triremes were the standard capital ships of ancient Mediterranean warfare. Sleek, fast vessels powered by 3 banks of oars and equipped with bronze rams on their prows. In skilled hands, a trireme could smash an enemy ship's hull below the waterline, sinking it in minutes. The fleet was not merely a support element. It was essential to the invasion plan. The Persian army would march down the coast, staying close to the shore where the fleet could resupply them. Greek geography made this necessary. The roads through Greece were poor, and moving a massive army through mountain terrain without accessible supply lines would lead to starvation. By keeping the fleet close, Xerxes ensured his army would never run short of food, water, or equipment. This strategy had a weakness, however. It tied the army's movement to the capabilities of the fleet. If the fleet was destroyed or driven away, the army would be cut off from supplies and forced to retreat. The Greeks understood this. It was why they planned to contest control of the sea. At the same time they held Thermopylae on land. If they could cripple the Persian fleet, they could starve the Persian army regardless of how many soldiers it contained. To get his army from Asia to Europe, Xerxes needed to cross the Hellespont, the narrow strait that separated the two continents. Persian engineers constructed 2 bridges of boats lashed together with rope and cable, creating floating roadways stable enough to support the passage of hundreds of thousands of men, horses, and supply wagons. Ancient sources claim the bridges were a marvel of engineering, proof of Persian technical sophistication. Herodotus tells a story that may or may not be true, but which captures something essential about Xerxes' character. When storms destroyed the first set of bridges, Xerxes reportedly ordered his men to whip the water 300 times as punishment. He had chains thrown into the Hellespont, symbolically enslaving the sea for its disobedience. Whether or not this literally happened, it reflects the Persian understanding of kingship. The great king did not negotiate with nature. He commanded it. The world existed to serve his will, and when the world failed to obey, it was punished. The crossing of the Hellespont took 7 days and 7 nights. The army moved in continuous columns, day and night without stopping. Herodotus claims that when local rivers could not provide enough water for all the men and animals, those rivers ran dry. Again, this is likely exaggeration, but it captures the scale of the operation. This was not a normal army. This was a migration, a moving nation. The Persians brought everything they needed. Thousands of supply wagons carried food, tents, weapons, and tools. Herds of cattle and sheep traveled with the army, providing fresh meat. Engineers brought materials to construct bridges over rivers and to repair roads that could not support the weight of the massive baggage train. Medical personnel treated the inevitable injuries and illnesses that arose when hundreds of thousands of people moved through unfamiliar territory. But the army also brought luxuries. Xerxes traveled with his entire court, concubines, servants, cooks, entertainers. He brought furniture, fine clothing, gold and silver vessels for his meals. He maintained the ceremonial dignity of the great king even while on campaign. This was not just personal vanity, it was psychological warfare. When envoys from Greek cities came to negotiate or surrender, they saw not a desperate military commander, but a king living in unimaginable luxury while his army prepared to destroy their homes. The message was clear. Persia was so powerful that its king could wage war without any personal sacrifice. As the Persian army marched through northern Greece, city after city submitted without resistance. Thessaly, the large northern region, Medized, the term Greeks used for collaboration with the Medes, their name for the Persians. Macedon, technically an independent kingdom, provided troops and supplies to the invasion force. The cities of Boeotia wavered, unsure whether to resist or surrender. Xerxes sent heralds ahead of his army to Greek cities, demanding earth and water as symbols of submission. Many cities complied. They calculated that resistance was futile and that submission might preserve their wealth and autonomy. They were not wrong to think this. The Persians had no interest in micromanaging every city in their empire. Subject peoples who paid tribute and provided troops when requested were largely left alone. Submission did not mean annihilation, but it did mean the end of Greek independence. It meant acknowledging that decisions affecting their lives would be made by a foreign king in a distant capital. It meant sending their sons to fight in Persian wars. It meant that their gods, their laws, their way of life existed only at the sufferance of the great king. Some cities refused. Athens, traumatized by the sack of their city during the previous Persian invasion attempt, was committed to resistance. The Athenians had executed Persian heralds when they arrived, demanding submission, throwing them into a pit, a shocking violation of diplomatic norms that signaled absolute refusal to negotiate. Sparta had done the same. These acts made compromise impossible. Athens and Sparta had declared total war. They would win or they would be destroyed. As Xerxes marched south through Thessaly, his scouts brought him reports about the Greek defensive position at Thermopylae. The pass was occupied. A Greek army, small but organized, had fortified the narrows and showed no signs of withdrawing. Xerxes must have been puzzled. The reports indicated only a few thousand Greeks, led by Spartans. Against his army of hundreds of thousands, this was absurd. Why had the Greeks not retreated to a more defensible position further south? Why sacrifice men in a pass that would eventually fall? What did they hope to accomplish? The great king sent a scout to observe the Greek position. What the scout reported back must have seemed insane. The Spartans were visible outside, their fortifications exercising. Some were naked, engaging in gymnastics. Others were combing their long hair, carefully maintaining their appearance. They showed no signs of fear or urgency. They acted as though the approaching Persian army was of no concern whatsoever. Xerxes consulted Demaratus, a former Spartan king who had been exiled years earlier and now served as an advisor to the Persian court. Demaratus explained what the Persians were witnessing. The Spartans were preparing for battle in their traditional manner. They exercised to keep their bodies ready. They groomed themselves because Spartan warriors beautified themselves before combat, treating war as a sacred ritual requiring proper preparation. And they stood their ground because Spartans did not retreat. Ever. Demaratus warned Xerxes that the Spartans would fight to the death. They would not surrender. They would not flee. The only way through Thermopylae was to kill every single Greek in the pass. Xerxes dismissed this warning. He had fought many enemies, defeated many armies. Every warrior culture claimed to be fearless until the moment they faced overwhelming force. The Spartans would break like everyone else. Xerxes deployed his army before the pass and waited. This was standard Persian practice. Before attacking, the great king would give enemies time to reconsider, time to recognize the hopelessness of their situation and surrender. It was a mercy, really. Why waste Persian lives and enemy lives when submission was inevitable? For 4 days the Persian army sat before Thermopylae. The Greeks did not withdraw. They did not send envoys to negotiate. They simply held their position, maintaining their formations, waiting. On the morning of the 5th day, Xerxes' patience ended. He gave the order to attack. The Persians had expected this to be simple. They had crushed dozens of armies before. They had conquered nations. A small Greek force in a narrow pass was an obstacle. Nothing more. What they did not understand, what they could not understand until they experienced it, was that they were not attacking men. They were attacking Spartans, and Spartans did not lose. Leonidas and the 300. When Leonidas looked at his 300 warriors, he did not see heroes. He saw brothers, men he had trained with, fought beside, lived with for decades. Each face was familiar. Each man's strengths and weaknesses were known to him. These were not strangers thrown together by chance. They were a single organism, perfected through years of shared hardship. The selection of these men was not arbitrary. Leonidas had chosen each warrior personally, and his criteria went beyond military skill. He needed men with living sons, ensuring their bloodlines would continue. But he also needed men of unshakable mental discipline, warriors who could function under extreme stress without losing cohesion. He needed men whose families would not pressure them to abandon their duty. And he needed men who understood, viscerally and completely, that they were marching to their deaths. Not everyone understood at first. Some warriors, when told they were chosen for the Thermopylae expedition, felt honored. They assumed this was a reconnaissance mission, a holding action until the full Spartan army could march north after the religious festivals ended. Only gradually, as they prepared for departure, did the reality become clear. They were not buying time for reinforcements. They were not conducting a strategic delay. They were marching to a place from which they would not return. The religious festivals were an excuse, a polite fiction that allowed Sparta to sacrifice a small force without officially violating sacred law. Leonidas was taking 300 men to their deaths because Sparta needed this done and could not send its full army without angering the gods. The warriors accepted this without complaint. They had been raised for this exact situation. Since childhood, they had been taught that death in battle was the highest achievement possible for a Spartan male. They had been shown that individual survival meant nothing compared to the survival of the community. They had internalized the truth that glory came not from living long, but from dying well. Still, these were human beings, not automatons. They had wives, they had children, they had preferences, and fears, and regrets. The night before departure, each man returned to his home one final time. They held their children. They made love to their wives. They walked through rooms where they had lived their few precious hours of private life, knowing they would never see these places again. Spartan culture discouraged emotional displays, but it did not forbid private grief. A man could weep in his home, alone with his wife, as long as he showed no weakness in public. The women of Sparta, for their part, were expected to be strong. They were not supposed to beg their husbands to stay, not supposed to make the leaving harder. Their role was to send their men to war sore with pride and to accept their deaths without visible mourning. One famous story, perhaps apocryphal but nonetheless illustrative of Spartan values, tells of a wife asking her husband to return with his shield or on it. She was not being cruel. She was reminding him of his duty. Come back victorious carrying your shield, or come back dead, carried on it. But do not come back having abandoned your comrades. When Leonidas and his 300 departed Sparta, they marched in formation, singing hymns to Castor and Pollux, the divine twins who protected warriors. They wore their red cloaks, the distinctive garment that marked them as Spartiates. They carried their shields, spears, and short swords. They brought minimal supplies. Helots would handle logistics. As they marched north, they were joined by perioikoi, free men who lived in Spartan territory, but were not full citizens, and by helots, who served as attendants. The helots carried food, water, spare equipment, and materials for building fortifications. They would die at Thermopylae too, though history has forgotten their names. When the ancient sources speak of the 300, they mean 300 Spartiates. The actual number of men who died with Leonidas was far higher. The march north took several days. Leonidas moved deliberately, stopping at allied cities to gather additional troops. The Thespians, whose territory lay close to Thebes and who feared being conquered by the Persians, sent 700 hoplites. This represented a huge portion of Thespia's military strength. For a small city to commit 700 men to what everyone knew was a suicide mission demonstrated extraordinary courage. The Thebans sent 400 men, but their commitment was suspect. Thebes had powerful factions that favored collaboration with Persia. Some modern historians believe the Theban contingent at Thermopylae was effectively held hostage by Leonidas, forced to participate to prevent their city from overtly siding with Xerxes. Whether this is true or not, the Thebans would surrender to the Persians on the final day of battle, an act that earned them contempt throughout the Greek world for generations. By the time Leonidas reached Thermopylae, his force numbered between 5,000 and 7,000 men. The ancient sources give contradictory numbers, but somewhere in this range is likely accurate. This was not a large army. It was barely adequate to hold the narrow pass, especially if the fighting went on for more than a few days. Casualties would be inevitable, and there were no reserves to replace losses. Leonidas understood the reality of his situation better than anyone. He was a king, yes, but more importantly, he was a veteran warrior who had spent his entire life studying war. He knew that holding Thermopylae permanently was impossible. The Persians would eventually find a way around or simply wear down his small force through attrition. His real objective was not to win, but to delay, to hold the pass long enough for the Greek city-states to complete their preparations, for the fleet to engage the Persian navy, and for the psychological impact of Greek resistance to register in the minds of wavering allies. But there was another objective, one that was perhaps even more important: to make the Persians bleed. Xerxes had marched through northern Greece, accepting surrender after surrender. He believed the Greeks were weak, divided, terrified. By making the Persians pay in blood for every inch of ground, Leonidas could shatter that assumption. He could prove that conquering Greece would be expensive and difficult. He could give heart to those Greeks who wanted to resist, but who feared the Persians were invincible. When Leonidas arrived at Thermopylae, he immediately set his men to work rebuilding the Phocian Wall. This ancient fortification had been constructed generations earlier by the Phocians to defend against invasions from the north, but it had fallen into disrepair. Leonidas's men hauled stones, repaired gaps, and built up the wall until it formed a solid barrier across the narrowest part of the pass. The wall was not particularly high, perhaps 6 or 7 feet, but it did not need to be. Its purpose was not to keep the Persians out, but to force them to climb over an obstacle while being stabbed from above. Any soldier attempting to scale the wall would be slowed, off balance, and vulnerable. Meanwhile, Greek hoplites standing behind the wall could thrust their spears downward into exposed faces and necks. Leonidas positioned his troops carefully. The Spartans held the center of the line, the position of greatest honor and greatest danger. The allied Greeks held the flanks. This arrangement made sense tactically. Spartan discipline and experience would hold the line even under extreme pressure, but it also made political sense. If the Spartans occupied the position of greatest danger, none of the allies could accuse them of sacrificing non-Spartan lives to save their own. The pass at Thermopylae was not a single uniform corridor. It widened and narrowed at different points along its length. At its western end, where the Greeks positioned themselves, the pass was relatively narrow, but still wide enough to accommodate several dozen men fighting side by side. Further east, closer to where the Persian army would approach from, the pass widened considerably, allowing larger formations to deploy. Leonidas stationed scouts on the mountain slopes to watch for any Persian attempts to use the Anapaya path, the mountain trail that bypassed the main pass. He placed 1,000 Phocian troops on the path itself, trusting them to hold this critical flank. This was a risk. The Phocians were not Spartans, and their reliability under pressure was uncertain, but Leonidas had no choice. He did not have enough men to both hold the main pass and adequately guard the mountain trail. Once the defensive positions were established, the Greeks waited, and while they waited, they prepared. Spartan warriors sharpened their spears, checked their armor for damage, and exercised to keep their muscles ready. They ate sparingly, knowing that prolonged combat would require reserves of energy. They slept in shifts, ensuring that the defenses were always manned. But they also engaged in activities that must have seemed bizarre to anyone unfamiliar with Spartan customs. They combed their hair, carefully arranging their long locks. They oiled their bodies. They engaged in gymnastics and dance-like exercises that kept them limber while also serving as a form of meditation. These rituals were not vanity. They were preparation for sacred combat. Spartans believed that a warrior should meet death beautifully, that the moment of death in battle was so important it required proper preparation. By beautifying themselves, they honored the gods and honored their enemy. They showed that they were not afraid, that they welcomed the coming battle as an opportunity for glory. When Xerxes' scout observed the Spartans exercising and grooming themselves, he reported back to the great king that the Greeks seemed insane. They were about to be slaughtered, yet they showed no fear, no urgency. They acted as though they were preparing for a festival, not a battle. Demaratus, the exiled Spartan king, tried to explain. These men were not crazy. They were doing what Spartans always did before battle. They were preparing their souls as well as their bodies, and the fact that they showed no sign of fear meant they would not break when the fighting started. Xerxes remained unconvinced. He had seen many warriors claim to be fearless. They all broke eventually. Everyone broke when faced with overwhelming force. Leonidas used the days before battle to speak with his men, though speak is perhaps too grand a word for the terse Spartan exchanges. He did not give speeches, he made observations, he issued reminders. He ensured that every man understood the tactical plan and his role within it. The plan was simple, as all good plans are. When the Persians attacked, the Greeks would meet them at the wall. The phalanx would hold its ground. presenting an unbroken wall of shields and spears. The men in front would fight until exhausted, then fall back through the ranks to rest, while fresh warriors took their place. This rotation would allow the Greeks to maintain combat effectiveness even during prolonged engagements. The key was discipline. If any man broke formation, if any section of the phalanx wavered, the entire defensive line would collapse. Persian numbers would pour through the gap, surrounding and destroying the Greek force. But if the phalanx held, if every man trusted the man beside him and kept his shield in position, the Persians would dash themselves against an immovable wall. Leonidas emphasized this point constantly. Do not seek personal glory. Do not try to prove your individual courage. Keep your position. Trust your brothers. Win or lose as a unit. The Spartans did not need this reminder. It had been drilled into them since childhood. But the allied Greeks did. Men from other cities were accustomed to more flexible formations, to individual combat, to tactical improvisation. Leonidas needed them to understand that in this pass, flexibility was death. Only rigid, unyielding discipline would preserve their lives. On the fourth day of waiting, as the Persian army completed its deployment before the pass, Leonidas walked the length of the Greek line. He moved slowly, stopping to speak quietly with small groups of warriors. He did not deliver dramatic pronouncements. He simply reminded them of what they already knew. You are here because your cities need you. You are here because if we do not hold this pass, Greece falls. You are here because sometimes the only way to win is to refuse to lose. Hold your ground, keep your shield up, stab for the throat and groin. When you tire, fall back. Let your brothers carry the fight. Rest, return to the line. Do this and we win. We may die, but we win. That night, the Greeks made sacrifices to the gods. They poured libations of wine onto the ground. They burned offerings of meat. They prayed to Ares, god of war, and to Athena, goddess of wisdom and tactical warfare. They asked not for survival, but for courage. They asked to die well. Leonidas made his own sacrifice, separate from the others. He called upon the gods to witness what was about to happen. He promised them blood and glory. He asked them to remember these warriors when they fell. And then he slept, not fitfully, not anxiously, but deeply and peacefully. He had made his decision. He had positioned his men. The outcome was now in the hands of the gods and the skill of his warriors. Worrying would change nothing. When dawn broke on the Yeisei, fifth day, the Persians began forming their battle lines. The sound of their assembly carried across the pass, the tramp of thousands of feet, the clash of weapons being readied, the shouts of officers organizing their units. Leonidas rose. He donned his armor, bronze breastplate, greaves to protect his shins, a helmet with a horsehair crest that marked him as a king. He picked up his shield, solid bronze over wood, heavy enough to serve as a weapon itself. He hefted his spear, 8 feet of ash wood tipped with iron, balanced for thrusting rather than throwing. He walked to the front of the Greek formation and took his position in the front rank. Kings did not command from safety in Sparta. They fought at the point of greatest danger, leading by example. The 300 formed around him. They locked their shields together, each man's shield overlapping with his neighbor's. They leveled their spears, creating a forest of iron points facing toward the approaching Persians. Behind them, the allied Greeks formed up in supporting ranks. 7,000 men, give or take, compressed into a narrow strip of land barely 50 feet wide at its narrowest point. Across the plain before them, the Persian army assembled. Tens of thousands of warriors, perhaps hundreds of thousands. The exact number did not matter. There were enough Persians that if every Greek killed 10 enemies, the Persians would still vastly outnumber them. Xerxes, watching from a high throne, positioned where he could observe the battle, gave the signal. Drums beat, horns sounded, and the Persian army began to advance. Leonidas said nothing. There was nothing left to say. He simply stood in the front rank, shield up, spear ready, and waited for the enemy to reach him. The Spartans waited with him. 300 men who had been born for this moment. 300 men who would prove that courage and discipline and brotherhood can stand against any odds. 300 men who would not move. The first day of battle. The Persians came in waves, not in the organized, disciplined manner of a professional army, but in the looser, more chaotic style of a tribal host. The first units to advance were Medes and Scythians, warriors from the Iranian plateau who fought with short spears, wicker shields, and scale armor. These were not elite troops. They were levies, soldiers drawn from subject peoples and given basic equipment and minimal training. Xerxes was sending them forward to test the Greek defenses, to probe for weakness, to tire the defenders before committing his better troops. From the Greek perspective, the sight must have been terrifying. Thousands of men advancing in loose formation, chanting war cries in languages the Greeks did not understand. The sound alone was overwhelming, the thunder of feet striking the ground, the rattle of equipment, the shouts of officers trying to maintain some semblance of organization among troops who spoke different languages and had trained separately. But Leonidas had prepared his men for exactly this moment. The Spartans stood motionless behind the rebuilt Phocian wall, shields locked together, spears angled forward. They did not shout back. They did not posture or threaten. They simply waited, silent and immovable, like a wall of bronze and flesh. The Persians expected the Greeks to break and run. Every army they had faced before had either surrendered without fighting or had collapsed after the first clash. The sheer size of the Persian force was usually enough to shatter enemy morale. Soldiers who might be brave when fighting against equal numbers became paralyzed with fear when facing overwhelming odds. The Greeks did not run. When the Persian front ranks came within 50 feet of the wall, the Greeks unleashed their first response. Javelins arced over the wall, thrown by men in the rear ranks. These were not meant to inflict mass casualties. The target area was too narrow for that. But to disrupt the Persian charge, to force the attackers to slow down and raise their shields, breaking their momentum. Then the Persians hit the wall. The collision was not glorious. It was ugly and brutal and desperate. Persian soldiers scrambled over the stones, trying to gain purchase on the uneven surface, while Greek spears stabbed down at them. Men slipped on rocks made slick with blood. They clutched at stones with one hand while trying to fend off spear thrusts with their shields. Some made it to the top of the wall, only to be shoved back by the weight of the Greek phalanx pushing forward. Others fell, pierced through the throat or face, and tumbled back onto the men climbing behind them. The Spartans fought with mechanical precision. Each thrust was aimed at a specific target: throat, groin, armpit, any place where Persian armor offered minimal protection. They did not swing wildly or waste energy on dramatic flourishes. They stabbed, withdrew their spears, stabbed again. When a spear shaft broke, and wooden shafts broke frequently when stabbed into bone and twisted, the warrior immediately drew his short sword and continued fighting. The key to Spartan effectiveness was not individual skill, though each man was highly skilled. It was coordination. The Greek phalanx worked because every man understood his role and performed it without hesitation. When a warrior in the front rank tired, he would call out and step back, and the man behind him would instantly step forward to fill the gap. This rotation happened constantly throughout the battle, ensuring that the Greeks always presented fresh fighters to the enemy, while exhausted men recovered in the rear ranks. The Persians had no comparable system. Their troops fought as individuals or in small groups, each unit operating independently without much central coordination. When a Persian warrior tired, he had to extract himself from combat on his own and hope he could make it to safety before being cut down. There was no organized rotation, no systematic relief. This meant that Persian soldiers in the front ranks fought until they dropped from exhaustion or were killed. Moreover, Persian equipment was poorly suited for this type of close-quarters fighting. Their wicker shields, light and maneuverable, were excellent for skirmishing or for protecting archers, but they could not stand up to the heavy Greek spears. A Spartan spear thrust would punch straight through wicker and into the body behind it. Persian scale armor offered better protection, but it still had gaps at the joints and could be penetrated by a strong thrust. Greek hoplite armor, by contrast, was designed specifically for phalanx warfare. The aspis shield was solid wood faced with bronze, heavy but nearly impenetrable. The bronze breastplate protected the torso, greaves protected the shins, a good helmet protected the head and face, leaving only the eyes, nose, and mouth exposed. A fully armored hoplite was incredibly difficult to kill from the front. Most hoplite casualties came from wounds to the groin or thighs, the one area that armor left largely exposed because protecting it would have made walking impossible. For perhaps an hour, the Medes and Scythians hurled themselves against the wall. They fought bravely, climbing over their own dead in desperate attempts to break through. But they made no progress. The Greek line did not budge. Every Persian who made it over the wall was immediately killed by spear thrusts from multiple angles. Bodies piled up at the base of the fortifications, making it even harder for subsequent waves to approach. Finally, the Persian officers called retreat. Horns sounded, and the Medes and Scythians fell back, leaving hundreds of dead behind them. The Greeks remained in position, bloodied but unbroken. They had won the first exchange, but it had cost them. Several Greeks lay dead, struck by Persian spears or arrows. Others nursed wounds, gashes, and punctures that would need attention before they could return to the fight. Leonidas ordered a brief respite. Water was distributed. Wounded men were dragged back from the line and treated as best as possible with the limited medical supplies available. The wall itself was inspected for damage and quickly repaired where stones had been dislodged. Dead Persians were pushed away from the fortifications to clear space for the next attack. The Spartans showed no emotion. They did not celebrate their small victory. They knew this was only the beginning. The Medes and Scythians were expendable troops, sent forward to soften up the Greek defenses. The real test would come when the Persians committed their better units. That test came shortly after midday. Xerxes, watching from his elevated throne, was furious. His troops had been repulsed by a handful of Greeks hiding behind a wall. This was unacceptable. The entire invasion was being delayed by an insignificant force in an insignificant pass. If word spread that the Greeks had successfully resisted Persian attack, wavering cities might find courage to join the resistance. The great king ordered a second assault, this time using better troops. Elite Persian infantry advanced toward the pass, warriors who had trained together and fought together in previous campaigns. These men wore better armor, carried better weapons, and understood battlefield tactics. They would not simply charge the wall like the Medes had. They would fight intelligently, probing for weaknesses, coordinating their attacks. The Greeks watched them come. The Persians advanced in tighter formation this time, shields raised to protect against javelins. They moved more cautiously, trying to identify weak points in the Greek line before committing to an all-out assault. Leonidas made a calculated decision. Rather than wait behind the wall for the Persians to attack, he would take the fight to them. He gave a command, and the Spartans began to advance. Not quickly, not in a disorganized rush, but in a controlled, synchronized march. The phalanx moved as one entity, shields locked, spears leveled, each man keeping perfect spacing with his neighbors. This was the Greek advantage. The phalanx was not just a defensive formation. When properly employed, it was an offensive weapon of terrifying power. 8 rows of men moving in perfect unison, each row adding weight and momentum to the whole. When a Greek phalanx charged, it hit like a battering ram. No loose formation could stand against it. The Persians saw the Greeks advancing and attempted to brace themselves, but they were not accustomed to fighting in such narrow confines. In the open plains of Asia, Persian tactics relied on mobility, on flanking movements and archery barrages. Here, compressed into a space barely 50 feet wide, they had no room to maneuver. They could only stand and receive the Greek charge. The phalanx hit them with crushing force. The sound of impact, bronze on bronze, wood on flesh, the screams of men being crushed or speared, echoed through the pass. The front ranks of the Persian formation simply disintegrated. Men were driven backward, trampled by their own comrades, impaled on Greek spears. The Spartans did not slow. They pushed forward, stepping over bodies, maintaining their formation even as they advanced into the mass of Persian troops. Their spears stabbed out in a rhythm, each thrust precisely timed. When a Persian fell, the Greek warrior who killed him immediately engaged the next enemy, not pausing to ensure the first was dead. In the phalanx, you trusted the men behind you to finish off wounded enemies. Your job was to keep moving forward. For several minutes, the Greeks drove deep into the Persian formation. It seemed, briefly, as though they might break through entirely and scatter the attackers. But Leonidas was too experienced to allow that to happen. He knew that if the phalanx broke apart in pursuit, the Persians would swarm around them and cut them down. He gave the signal to halt, and the Spartans immediately stopped advancing. Then, with the same precision they had shown in the charge, they began to withdraw. This is when the Spartans demonstrated the full extent of their superiority. Retreating in the face of the enemy is one of the most difficult military maneuvers. It requires absolute discipline and trust. If men panic and turn to run, they expose their unprotected backs and are slaughtered. But if they retreat in formation, shields still facing the enemy, they can disengage safely. The Spartans executed a feigned retreat, one of the most sophisticated tactics in ancient warfare. They turned and began moving back toward the wall, but they did so in perfect order, maintaining their spacing, keeping their shields raised. To the Persians, it looked like the Greeks were breaking, fleeing back to their fortifications in panic. The Persians took the bait. They surged forward, eager to exploit what they thought was a collapse in Greek morale. They abandoned their own formation, rushing forward as individuals rather than as a coordinated unit. They wanted to cut down the retreating Greeks before they could reach the safety of the wall. And then Leonidas gave the command to turn and fight. The Spartans pivoted on command, forming back into phalanx instantly. The Persians, who had been charging forward in loose order, suddenly found themselves facing a reformed shield wall. Before they could react, the Greeks counterattacked. The phalanx surged forward again, slamming into the disorganized Persians with devastating effect. This time, the slaughter was even worse. Persians who had broken formation to pursue the Greeks had no protection, no coordination. They were isolated individuals being killed by an organized military unit. Greek spears found throats, groins, faces. Persian soldiers tried to flee, but the crush of bodies behind them prevented escape. They died where they stood, packed too tightly to even fall down. The Persians broke. Those who could turned and ran, scrambling over the bodies of their fallen comrades in desperate flight. The Greeks pursued only a short distance, then reformed their line and marched back to the wall. They had proven their point. They had demonstrated that Greek discipline could defeat Persian numbers. All along the narrow pass, Persian bodies lay scattered. Hundreds were dead. More were wounded, moaning and crying out for help that would not come. The Greeks had suffered casualties as well, a few dozen men killed or too badly wounded to continue fighting, but the exchange ratio was staggeringly one-sided. For every Greek who fell, 10 or more Persians died. Xerxes, watching from his throne, was reportedly so agitated that he leapt to his feet 3 times during the battle, horrified at the losses his army was taking. This was not how wars were supposed to go. The great king commanded the largest army in the world. He had crushed every enemy he faced. These Greeks should have been swept aside effortlessly. Instead, they were killing his men by the hundreds. The great king called off the attack and ordered his commanders to regroup. He needed a new plan. Direct assault was clearly not working. The pass was too narrow, giving all the advantages to the defenders. Persian numbers meant nothing if they could not be brought to bear effectively. As the sun began to set on the first day of battle, both sides assessed their situations. The Persians had lost perhaps 1,000 men, maybe more, and had accomplished nothing. The pass remained firmly in Greek hands. Morale among the Persian troops was shaken. These were men who had marched across the empire, believing they were part of an invincible force. Now they had watched their comrades die uselessly against a wall held by a few thousand Greeks. The Greeks, for their part, were exhausted but triumphant. They had done what many thought impossible. They had repulsed multiple Persian attacks and inflicted heavy casualties. But they also understood that this was only the first day. The Persians would return tomorrow and the day after, until eventually The sheer weight of numbers wore them down. The Greeks could not sustain heavy losses. The Persians could afford to trade men at a 10-to-1 ratio and still have overwhelming numerical superiority. Leonidas walked among his men as darkness fell. He checked on the wounded, spoke quietly with the dead, ensured that his warriors were fed and rested. He showed no sign of fatigue or stress. He appeared calm, almost serene, as though the day's bloodshed had been nothing more than a routine training exercise. But he was making calculations. He had perhaps 50 Spartans dead or seriously wounded. The allied Greeks had suffered similarly. He still had enough men to hold the pass, but only barely. If tomorrow's fighting was as intense as today's, he would start running short of effective combatants. The Persians, meanwhile, were learning. They had seen how the Greek phalanx worked. They understood now that frontal assault would not succeed. Tomorrow they would try something different. They would send their best troops, warriors trained to fight in close formation, men who might be able to match Greek discipline. Tomorrow the Immortals would attack, and Leonidas knew it. The second day, dawn came too quickly. The Greeks had slept in shifts, never leaving the pass undefended, but even those who rested found little peace. The groans of wounded men echoed through the night. The smell of blood and death hung in the air, thick and inescapable. Summer heat reflected off the rocky cliffs, turning the pass into an oven even before the sun fully rose. The Spartans rose in silence. They checked their equipment with mechanical thoroughness, testing each strap and buckle, examining spear shafts for cracks, ensuring that shields were properly secured. These rituals had been ingrained since childhood. A weapon that failed at the critical moment meant death, not just for yourself, but for your brothers standing beside you. Food was distributed: dried meat, bread, water mixed with wine. Not much, but enough to sustain men for hours of combat. Spartan warriors were trained to function on minimal rations, to ignore hunger and thirst when battle demanded it. They ate without pleasure or complaint, fuel for a machine designed to kill. Across the plain, the Persian army stirred, tens of thousands of men prepared for another day of assault. But something was different this morning. The troops assembling before the pass were not tribal levies or provincial conscripts. These were elite warriors, the core of the Persian military machine. The Immortals were forming up. 10,000 strong, they assembled with precision that rivaled even Spartan discipline. Each man wore identical equipment: scale armor that covered the torso, arms, and thighs, a distinctive tiara, hat rather than a helmet, and they carried both spears and bows. They moved in organized formations, units of 1,000 men each, responding instantly to commands from their officers. These were not soldiers who fought for pay or because they had been conscripted. These were professional warriors who had trained together for years, bound by oaths of loyalty to the great king. They were called Immortals, not as propaganda, but as a statement of fact. Their unit never diminished in strength because every loss was immediately replaced. When a man died, another stepped into his place, maintaining the unit at exactly 10,000 men. They were not invincible, but they were very, very good, and they had never been defeated. Xerxes had held them back the previous day, hoping that lesser troops would be sufficient to break through. That hope had proven false. The Greeks had not only held, but had inflicted humiliating losses. Now the great king was committing his best soldiers. The Immortals would succeed where the Medes and Persians had failed, or they would prove that the Greeks at Thermopylae were something unprecedented in Persian military experience. Leonidas recognized the threat immediately. He had fought Persians before, though never the Immortals specifically, but he understood that disciplined professional soldiers would be far more dangerous than the troops who had attacked yesterday. The Immortals would not break formation in pursuit. They would not fall for feints. They would fight intelligently, exploiting any weakness in the Greek defense. He gathered his commanders, the leaders of the Spartan contingent and representatives from the allied forces, and gave instructions. The tactics would remain the same: hold the wall, rotate fresh men to the front, refuse to be drawn out into extended combat where Persian numbers could surround them. But today, every man needed to fight with absolute precision. No mistakes would be tolerated. The immortals would capitalize on any error instantly. The Greek warriors took their positions. The Spartans again occupied the center, the place of greatest danger and greatest honor. The allied troops held the flanks. Behind them, reserves waited to replace casualties or to reinforce any section of the line that showed signs of buckling. The immortals advanced. They did not charge. They did not shout war cries or beat their weapons against their shields. They simply marched forward in tight formation, moving with the same inexorable confidence as the Greek phalanx itself. Officers walked alongside the ranks, calling out commands that kept the formation aligned despite the uneven ground. When they came within range, Greek javelins arced over the wall. The immortals raised their shields in synchronized response, and most of the javelins clattered harmlessly off bronze or embedded in wooden shield surfaces. A few found targets, no defense is perfect, but the immortals did not falter. The wounded simply dropped out of formation, and other men closed the gaps. Then they reached the wall. Unlike the previous day's attackers, the immortals did not try to scramble over in a chaotic rush. They formed up at the base and began a methodical assault, with some men providing cover with their shields, while others attempted to dislodge stones or find handholds. Persian archers positioned behind the assault troops began loosing arrows at the Greeks, forcing the defenders to keep their shields raised and reducing their ability to strike at the immortals below. Leonidas responded by ordering a counter-advance. Once again, the Greeks emerged from behind the wall and formed their phalanx in the open space beyond. This took tremendous courage, leaving a fortified position to fight in the open, but it was necessary. If the immortals were allowed to methodically dismantle the wall while covered by archery, they would eventually break through. The two forces met 50 feet from the wall, and the battle became a grinding test of endurance and discipline. This was phalanx against phalanx, the most brutal form of ancient combat. Both sides formed into tight formations, shields locked together, spears bristling forward. Neither could easily outmaneuver the other in the narrow pass. Victory would go to whichever force could maintain formation longer, could continue pushing when every muscle screamed for rest, could keep fighting when exhaustion and terror demanded flight. The initial collision was thunderous. Hundreds of shields smashed together simultaneously. The front ranks of both formations became immediately locked in desperate combat, spears jabbing at any exposed flesh, men pushing with their shields to try to drive the enemy backward, warriors in the rear ranks leaning forward to add their weight to the push. This was othismos, the push, the moment when phalanx warfare transformed from individual combat into a collective shoving match. The men in the baitodas front ranks could barely move. They were wedged so tightly between friend and foe that there was no room to swing a weapon. They could only thrust their spears in short, brutal jabs, aiming for throats and faces. Meanwhile, the men behind them pushed forward with all their strength, trying to drive the enemy back through sheer physical force. In othismos, the men in the front ranks often died, not from weapons but from crushing pressure and suffocation. Warriors pinned between advancing ranks had their ribs broken, their lungs compressed until they could not breathe. Some were trampled when they fell, unable to extract themselves from the press of bodies. Others passed out from heat and exhaustion, only to be speared where they stood because they could not move to defend themselves. The Spartans had trained for this their entire lives. They knew how to breathe despite the crushing pressure. They knew how to maintain their footing on ground slick with blood and viscera. Most importantly, they knew how to keep pushing even when every instinct screamed to pull back, to escape the horror of being crushed between walls of flesh and bronze. The immortals were good, better than any troops the Greeks had faced the previous day. They maintained their formation under pressure. They pushed back with coordinated strength. Their spears found targets, and Greek warriors began to fall. But they were not good enough. The Spartans had one critical advantage. They had been doing this since age 7. Every single Spartan in that phalanx had spent decades training specifically for this type of combat. The immortals were professional soldiers, yes, But their training emphasized versatility. They could fight in formation, conduct independent operations, serve as archers or spearmen as needed. The Spartans trained for exactly one thing: holding their position in the phalanx, no matter what. Slowly, incrementally, the Greek line began to drive forward. Not dramatically, sometimes only inches at a time, but forward nonetheless. The Immortals, despite their training and discipline, began to give ground. This was the moment when Persian equipment became a critical disadvantage. The Immortal spears were shorter than the Greek dory, meaning Persian warriors had to get closer to strike. Their scale armor, while effective against slashing attacks, could be penetrated by the powerful overhand thrusts of Greek spears, driven by men who had trained to generate maximum force. Their shields, while well made, were smaller and lighter than the Greek aspis, offering less protection in the grinding press of Othismos. The Immortals fought brilliantly. They did not break, they did not flee, but they could not hold against the Spartan phalanx. After perhaps 30 minutes of sustained combat, an eternity in the brutal world of hand-to-hand fighting, the Immortals began to fall back. Not in rout, not in panic, but in an organized withdrawal. Their officers called commands, and the formation pulled back step by step, maintaining cohesion even in retreat. The Greeks did not pursue far. Leonidas knew better than to extend his line into open ground where Persian numbers could envelop him. He advanced only to the point where the pass widened, claimed that ground, then ordered his men to halt and reform. The Immortals regrouped beyond spear range. They had suffered perhaps 500 casualties, killed, seriously wounded, or too exhausted to continue fighting. The Greeks had lost maybe 100 men, a smaller number in absolute terms, but a higher percentage of their total force. Leonidas could not afford many more exchanges like this. His army was small to begin with, and every loss reduced his combat effectiveness. But he had achieved something more valuable than preserving manpower. He had defeated the Immortals. The elite troops of the Persian Empire, the unit that had never lost a battle, had been driven back by Greek hoplites. News of this would spread. Every wavering Greek city would hear that the Persians were not invincible. Every allied soldier would take heart from the knowledge that even the great king's finest warriors could be beaten. Xerxes, watching from his throne, must have been apoplectic. He had committed his best troops, and they had failed, not through lack of courage or effort, but because Greek heavy infantry, fighting in terrain that favored their tactics, were simply superior to anything the Persian Empire could field. The great king had a problem. He could not force the pass through direct assault. His numbers meant nothing in the narrow confines of Thermopylae. His cavalry, the pride of Persian military might, was completely useless. Horses could not charge through the rocky terrain, could not maneuver in the compressed space. His archers, while numerous and skilled, could not shoot effectively into the pass without hitting his own troops. He had already lost well over 1,000 men, perhaps closer to 2,000. These were not catastrophic casualties in absolute terms. His army was vast enough to absorb such losses, but the psychological impact was significant. Soldiers who had believed they were part of an unstoppable force now knew they could be stopped. Officers who had dismissed Greek military capabilities now understood they had drastically underestimated their enemy. But Xerxes also knew something the Greeks did not. He had time. His supply lines were secure, maintained by his fleet sailing along the coast. He could afford to wait, to probe, to wear down the Greek defenders through attrition. The Greeks, by contrast, were trapped in the pass with limited supplies and no reinforcements. Every day they held was a victory, but every day also brought them closer to collapse. The great king ordered his troops to rest and reorganize. There would be no more assaults today. Let the Greeks sit in the pass, breathing the stench of death, wondering when the next attack would come. Let them exhaust themselves, maintaining constant vigilance. Tomorrow, or the day after, they would make a mistake. They would grow careless or tired, and when they did, the Persians would exploit that weakness. As afternoon turned to evening on the second day, both armies attended to their wounded and dead. The Persians had the easier task. They could send burial details to retrieve bodies without fear of Greek interference. The Greeks had to be more cautious, always maintaining a defensive line while some men dragged dead and wounded back from the forward positions. The Spartan dead were treated with particular reverence. Each body was washed, if water could be spared. Their shields were placed upon their chests, and their spears were laid alongside them. These men had died in battle, fulfilling the purpose for which they had been raised. They would be honored, though not mourned. Mourning suggested that death was a tragedy. For a Spartan, death in combat was the highest achievement possible. Leonidas walked among his surviving warriors as darkness fell. He stopped to speak with wounded men, offering quiet words of encouragement. He checked the defensive positions, ensuring that watches were set and that the men had food and water. He showed no sign of stress or doubt, though he must have been calculating their dwindling odds with cold precision. The math was simple and brutal. He had started with perhaps 300 Spartans and 6,000 to 7,000 allied troops. After 2 days of fighting, he was down to maybe 250 effective Spartans and roughly 5,000 allies. The Persians, meanwhile, had barely dented their total strength. They could afford to trade casualties at a rate of 10 to 1 and still win through attrition. Moreover, Leonidas knew that the allied troops, brave as they had proven, were approaching their limit. They were not Spartans, trained from childhood to endure impossible hardship. They were farmers and merchants who had picked up spears to defend their homes. They had fought magnificently for 2 days, but how much longer could they hold? When would fear finally overwhelm courage? Leonidas also worried about the Phocian troops guarding the mountain path. They had seen no action yet. The Persians had not attempted to use the Thermopylae trail, but those Phocians were far from home, isolated on a mountainside, wondering if they had been forgotten. Would they hold if the Persians discovered the path and attacked, or would they break, abandoning their position and dooming everyone in the pass? These were questions without answers. Leonidas could control only what happened within his immediate vicinity. He could not reinforce the Phocians without weakening his already thin line. He could not summon reserves that did not exist. All he could do was hold for 1 more day, and then another, until either relief came or the Persians found a way through. That night, something happened that would change everything, though the Greeks did not yet know it. A local man named Ephialtes approached the Persian camp. He had information to sell, he told the guards. Information about a path through the mountains, a way to bypass the Greek defenses at Thermopylae entirely. He was brought before Xerxes, and he told the great king exactly what he wanted to know. Betrayal at the mountain path. Ephialtes was a Malian, a native of the region around Thermopylae. He knew the mountains as only someone who had lived there his entire life could know them. He knew the trails and goat paths, the places where water could be found, the terrain that could be traversed, and the terrain that could not. And he knew the Thermopylae path, the mountain trail that wound through the heights west of Thermopylae and emerged behind the Greek position. His motivations for betraying the Greek cause are not entirely clear. Ancient sources claim he was motivated by greed, hoping for a reward from Xerxes. Some suggest he held a grudge against the Greeks for some personal slight. Others propose he was simply a pragmatist who recognized that Persian victory was inevitable and wanted to be on the winning side. The truth may never be known with certainty, but his actions would shape the course of history. When Ephialtes was brought before the great king, he prostrated himself and made his offer. For a reward, he would guide Persian troops along the mountain path. The path was too narrow and steep for cavalry or large formations, but a column of infantry could traverse it. If the Persians moved at night, they could reach the far end of the path by dawn and descend upon the Greek rear, trapping Leonidas' force between 2 armies. Xerxes must have received this news with profound relief. For 2 days his massive army had been stymied by a handful of Greeks in a narrow pass. He had committed his best troops, and they had been repulsed. The invasion, which should have been a triumphal march, had become a grinding siege. Now, suddenly, he had a way to break the stalemate. The great king summoned Hydarnes, the commander of the Immortals. Hydarnes was a capable and experienced officer, one of the few Persian nobles who had actually fought Greeks before. He understood that Greek hoplites were formidable opponents in close combat, but he also understood their limitations. If his Immortals could get behind the Greek position, descending from the heights in loose formation, rather than having to force the narrow pass, they could engage the Greeks on more favorable terms. Xerxes gave his orders. Hydarnes would take a substantial force, perhaps 1,000 or 2,000 Immortals, sources vary, and follow Ephialtes along the mountain path. They would march through the night, moving as quickly as the difficult terrain allowed. At dawn, they would descend upon the Greek rear, while simultaneously the main Persian army would assault the pass from the front. Trapped between two forces, the Greeks would be annihilated. As darkness fell on the second day of battle, the Immortals prepared to march. They stripped down their equipment, taking only what was necessary for a night march through mountains. They left their elaborate ceremonial gear behind, focusing on practical weapons and armor. They filled water skins, knowing that the mountain trail would be dry and exposed, and they followed Ephialtes into the darkness, beginning the climb that would bring them to the Greek rear. The Phocian troops guarding the Anapaia path had no warning of what was coming. They were stationed at a position where they could observe the main approach to the trail, but they had grown complacent after 2 days of inactivity. The Persians had shown no interest in the mountain path. Perhaps they did not know it existed. Perhaps they had decided it was too difficult to use. The Phocians maintained their watch, but without the sharp vigilance that comes from immediate danger. The Immortals climbed through the night. The going was slow and difficult. The path was barely wide enough for men to walk single file in places. The darkness made navigation treacherous. One misstep could send a man tumbling down a rocky slope. But Ephialtes knew the way, and the Immortals were professional soldiers accustomed to hardship. They pushed forward, silent and determined. As dawn approached, they were nearing the position where the Phocians were stationed. The sound of their approach, the inevitable noise of thousands of feet on stone, the clink of equipment, the heavy breathing of exhausted men, finally alerted the Greek guards. The Phocians realized, with mounting horror, that they were about to be attacked by a substantial enemy force. They scrambled to form a defensive line, calling out alerts and rushing to don their armor. But they were unprepared and disorganized, roused from sleep or from bored routine into sudden crisis. Hydarnes assessed the situation quickly. The Phocians numbered perhaps 1,000 men, and they were attempting to block the path. If the Immortals became bogged down in a fight here, the entire flanking maneuver would fail. The Greeks in the main pass would be alerted, and they might be able to reposition or even escape before the trap closed. But Hydarnes noticed something crucial. The Phocians were forming up directly on the path, blocking it, but the terrain nearby was open mountainside. The Immortals were not confined to the path itself. They could deploy into a broader formation on the slopes. Hydarnes ordered his archers forward. The Immortals, unlike most Greek troops, were trained in both archery and close combat. As the Phocians huddled together on the narrow path, Persian archers spread out on the hillside and began shooting. Arrows fell among the Phocians from multiple angles, killing and wounding men who had nowhere to take cover. The Phocians, to their credit, did not immediately break. They raised their shields and attempted to form a phalanx, but phalanx warfare required solid ground and enough space to maintain formation. On a narrow mountain path, under arrow fire from elevated positions, the phalanx could not function effectively. More critically, the Phocians realized they were not the Persians' main objective. The Immortals were not trying to destroy them. They were trying to get past them. Some of Hydarnes' troops engaged the Phocians directly, keeping them pinned down, while the main body of Immortals simply bypassed the Greek position, moving further down the mountain toward the rear of Thermopylae. The Phocian commander faced an impossible choice. He could stand and fight, engaging the Persians in a battle his troops would likely lose, or he could pull back, abandoning the path entirely and trying to warn Leonidas that the position was compromised. If he fought, his men might delay the Persians slightly, but they would probably be destroyed, and the warning would never reach the main force. If he retreated immediately, he could get word to Leonidas faster, but he would be abandoning his post without putting up significant resistance. He chose to retreat. It was the right tactical decision, but it sealed the fate of everyone at Thermopylae. The Phocians pulled back in some disorder, leaving the path open for the Immortals to continue their descent. Some Phocian runners sprinted ahead, racing down the mountain trails toward the main pass, desperate to warn Leonidas before it was too late. In the pass itself, the Greeks were preparing for another day of battle. They expected the Persians to attack again from the front, probably with renewed fury after the previous day's failures. They had no idea that thousands of enemy soldiers were, at that very moment, descending the mountain behind them. The first warning came not from the Phocian runners, but from Greek scouts positioned on the heights near the pass. These men, stationed to watch for enemy movements, saw something that chilled them to their cores: a column of Persian troops moving down from the mountains, heading directly for the Greek rear. The scouts sprinted back to Leonidas, bringing news that would transform the situation from desperate to hopeless. The Greeks were about to be surrounded. Leonidas received the reports with characteristic calm. He did not panic or rage at the Phocians for their failure to hold the mountain path. Recriminations were pointless. The situation was what it was, and he needed to respond appropriately. He called a quick council of the Greek commanders. The allied contingents, Thespians, Thebans, and others, gathered around the Spartan king to hear his assessment. Leonidas laid out the facts with brutal honesty. The Persians had found a way around their position. Within hours, possibly within the next hour, enemy troops would descend upon their rear. When that happened, the Greeks would be caught between two forces and annihilated. There was only one rational course of action: immediate retreat. If the Greeks withdrew now, they could escape before the Persians completed the encirclement. They would abandon Thermopylae, yes, but they would preserve their forces to fight another day. Most of the men could be saved. The allied commanders agreed. They began organizing their troops for withdrawal, preparing to march south as quickly as possible. Better to abandon a position than to die uselessly when the position could no longer be held. But Leonidas did not leave with them. He announced that he and the 300 Spartans would remain. They would hold the pass for a few more hours, buying time for the allies to escape, ensuring that the Persians could not pursue the retreating Greeks effectively. The Spartans would stay and fight until they were all dead. This was not bravado or theatrical gesture. It was cold calculation combined with cultural imperative. Militarily, someone needed to delay the Edois. Persian advance or the retreating allies would be caught and slaughtered on the road south. A rear guard was necessary, but more than that, Spartan law and custom forbade retreat. A Spartan did not abandon his position. He held until victory or death. Leonidas, as king, could not order his men to retreat without violating the fundamental principles that defined Spartan identity. There was also a political dimension. If Leonidas retreated, Sparta's reputation, the foundation of its power and influence in Greece, would be damaged irreparably. The Spartans had marched to Thermopylae, promising to hold. If they withdrew at the first serious setback, every Greek city would question whether Sparta could be trusted. The alliance against Persia would fracture, and Greece would fall piecemeal. By staying and dying, Leonidas would preserve Spartan honor. He would demonstrate that Spartans kept their commitments regardless of cost. And he would create a story so powerful that it would inspire Greeks for generations. Most of the allied troops withdrew. The Corinthians, the Arcadians, the men from cities across the Peloponnese, they marched south, grateful to be alive but also shamed that they were leaving while the Spartans stayed to die. Some would remember that shame forever, wondering if they should have remained as well. But not all the allies left. The 700 Thespians, led by their commander Demophilus, refused to go. They had marched to Thermopylae, knowing it was likely a one-way journey. They would not abandon their Spartan brothers at the end. If the Spartans were staying, the Thespians would stay too. The Thebans, 400 strong, also remained, though their presence was more ambiguous. Some sources claim they wanted to leave, but were held by Leonidas as hostages to ensure Thebes did not fully side with the Persians. Other sources suggest at least some Thebans chose to stay voluntarily, refusing to abandon the fight despite their city's wavering loyalty. The truth is unclear, but they were there at the end. As the Allied troops departed, Leonidas reorganized his remaining force. He now commanded perhaps 1,100 men, 300 Spartans, 700 Thespians, 400 Thebans, and the Helots who had accompanied the Spartans from the beginning. 1,100 men to face the entire Persian army, now attacking from both front and rear. There was no way to win. There was no hope of survival. There was only the choice of how to die. Leonidas chose defiance. Rather than wait behind the wall to be surrounded and overwhelmed, he would attack. He would take the fight to the Persians one last time. He would make them pay the highest possible price for this pass, and he would ensure that the story of this stand would be remembered, not as a desperate defense, but as an aggressive, furious refusal to yield. As dawn broke on the third day, the Spartans and their remaining allies prepared for their final battle. They checked their weapons one last time. They tightened the straps on their armor. They said quiet goodbyes to comrades they had fought beside for years, and then they marched out of the pass toward the waiting Persian army, ready to die as warriors should, on their feet, with weapons in their hands, taking as many enemies with them as possible. They marched toward immortality. The final stand. The sun rose on the third day of battle, casting long shadows across the pass. The Greeks stood in formation, facing north toward the main Persian army. Behind them, descending from the mountains, the Immortals were approaching their rear. Leonidas and his remaining warriors, Spartans, Thespians, and Thebans, were about to be crushed between two overwhelming forces. Any other army would have despaired. They would have negotiated for surrender terms or broken formation and fled, each man trying to save himself. But these were not ordinary soldiers. The Spartans, at least, had spent their entire lives preparing for exactly this moment. This was what the agoge had been designed to produce, men who could face certain death without flinching. Leonidas gave the order to advance. This was not the controlled, methodical advance of the previous days. This was a battle charge, fast and aggressive. The Greeks surged forward, moving at near run, shields raised, spears leveled. They were no longer fighting to hold a position. They were fighting to kill as many Persians as possible before they died. The sudden Greek attack caught the Persians off guard. After 2 days of defensive fighting, the enemy was supposed to be demoralized, weakened, ready to collapse. Instead, they were charging, attacking with even more ferocity than before. It made no tactical sense, but it made perfect psychological sense. The Greeks knew they were going to die. That knowledge liberated them from fear. There was nothing left to lose, no reason to be cautious. They could fight with absolute recklessness because survival was not an option. The Greek phalanx crashed into the Persian lines with devastating force. This time, they did not stop to hold ground. They pushed deep into the enemy formation, spears stabbing, shields smashing, using every ounce of strength to drive forward. The Persians, still assembling for what they thought would be a siege or a negotiated surrender, were completely unprepared for this assault. For a brief, glorious moment, it seemed as though the Greeks might actually break through the Persian center. Men fell away from the phalanx in every direction, cut down by the fury of the Greek attack. The Spartans fought like demons, each warrior killing multiple enemies in the first minutes of combat. Leonidas himself was at the front of the formation, fighting in the position of greatest danger, as Spartan kings always did. His skill and experience made him a force of nature. His spear found throat after throat. When his spear shattered, he drew his sword and continued killing. Warriors who came near him died. But numbers tell. For every Persian who fell, 10 more stepped forward to take his place. The Greek formation, surrounded and outnumbered hundreds to one, could not maintain its momentum. Slowly, inevitably, the phalanx began to compress as Persians pressed in from all sides. Greek warriors began to fall, not in ones or twos, but in growing numbers as fatigue and wounds accumulated. A man's shield would drop from exhaustion, and a Persian spear would find his throat. A warrior would slip on blood-slicked ground, and before he could rise, he would be trampled and stabbed. The Spartans and Thespians fought brilliantly, but they were only human, and humans can only fight for so long before their bodies fail. Leonidas was killed in the thick of the fighting. Ancient sources disagree on exactly how it happened. Was it a spear thrust, an arrow, a sword? The specifics do not matter. The Spartan king, 60 years old and fighting at the front of his formation, was struck down. He fell among his enemies, surrounded by the bodies of Persians he had killed. The moment Leonidas died, the battle transformed. The Spartans near him, seeing their king fall, fought with renewed fury to protect his body. In Greek culture, particularly in Spartan culture, recovering the body of a fallen warrior was a sacred duty. To allow the enemy to desecrate a warrior's corpse was the deepest shame. The men around Leonidas formed a protective circle, fighting desperately to hold the Persians back, while others dragged the king's body away from the immediate combat. The Persians, recognizing that this was the Spartan king, pressed their attack with equal determination. To capture or defile the enemy commander's body would be a tremendous propaganda victory. The struggle over Leonidas' corpse became a battle within the battle, brutal and personal. 4 times the Persians nearly reached the body. 4 times the Spartans drove them back. Men died in heaps around the fallen king. The ground became so slick with blood that warriors could barely keep their footing. The fighting degenerated from organized phalanx combat into a chaotic melee where individual strength and will mattered more than formation or tactics. Eventually, the surviving Greeks managed to pull Leonidas's body back toward the defensive wall. They were no longer attacking, they were simply trying to hold together long enough to die in formation, rather than be torn apart individually. The phalanx contracted, becoming smaller and denser as men fell and the survivors closed ranks. By this time, the immortals had completed their descent from the mountain path and were advancing on the Greek rear. The trap was closing. The Greeks were now fighting in a shrinking circle, enemies on every side, no escape possible. Greek spears began to break. The wooden shafts, subjected to hours of brutal use, snapped under stress. Warriors who lost their spears drew their short swords, the xiphos, a weapon of last resort, used when everything else had failed. Swords were less effective than spears in formation combat, but they were better than bare hands. When swords broke, the Greeks fought with their shields, smashing the heavy bronze-faced wood into Persian faces. When shields were lost, they fought with their hands and teeth, grappling with enemies, refusing to die easily. Ancient sources claim that some Spartans, having lost all weapons, killed Persians with their bare hands before finally being cut down. The Thebans, at some point during the final phase of the battle, surrendered. Exactly when and under what circumstances remains controversial. The dominant narrative, promoted by Sparta's allies, claims they surrendered as soon as the fighting turned decisively against the Greeks, proving their lack of commitment to the cause. Other sources suggest they fought valiantly for hours and only surrendered when their position became absolutely untenable and they had suffered heavy casualties. The truth likely lies somewhere between these extremes. The Thebans were not cowards. They had fought for 2 full days already, which required considerable courage. But they also were not Spartans, raised from childhood to view death in battle as the ultimate achievement. When continued fighting became obviously suicidal, they chose surrender over meaningless death. From their perspective, this was rational. From the Spartan perspective, it was unforgivable. Xerxes, we are told, was so enraged at the Thebans' surrender that he ordered them branded with the Persian mark of slavery, though he later released most of them. This harsh treatment seems to have been motivated less by anger at their resistance than by contempt for their surrender. The Persians, like the Spartans, valued warriors who fought to the death. Surrender was seen as dishonorable. The Spartans and Thespians did not surrender. They fought until they physically could not fight anymore. The phalanx disintegrated not through cowardice, but through sheer attrition. Men who could barely stand continued swinging broken weapons at enemies who seemed endless. When they finally fell, they fell knowing they had done everything possible. The final moments of the battle are difficult to reconstruct with certainty. Different ancient sources provide contradictory details, but the general outline is clear. The surviving Greeks, probably numbering less than 100 by this point, made a last stand on a small hill, later called the Hill of Leonidas, near the western end of the pass. They formed a final defensive circle, back to back, shields interlocked, facing outward in all directions. The Persians did not close for hand-to-hand combat. They had learned, over 3 days of brutal fighting, that trying to engage these Greeks in close quarters was suicide. Instead, they stood at a distance and shot arrows. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of arrows. The Greeks had no cover, no way to protect themselves. They could only stand and die under the arrow storm. Herodotus wrote that the Persians shot so many arrows that they literally buried the Greeks under missiles. This is certainly poetic exaggeration, but it captures the essence of what happened. The last Spartans and Thespians died not in glorious hand-to-hand combat, but under a rain of arrows, unable to reach their enemies, unable to strike back. They died on their feet, shields raised to the end, maintaining formation even as the life bled out of them. When the arrows finally stopped and Persian soldiers cautiously approached the hill, they found only corpses. Not a single Greek remained alive. The bodies were so thickly feathered with arrows that they resembled pincushions more than men. The Battle of Thermopylae was over. Xerxes walked among the Greek dead afterward. He was looking for Leonidas' body. When it was finally identified, probably through some mark of kingship, perhaps the remains of his armor or cloak, Xerxes reportedly ordered it decapitated and the head placed on a pike. This was a gross violation of Greek custom and of Persian custom as well. It was an act of rage, of frustration at how much this small force had cost him. The desecration of Leonidas' body was meant to humiliate the Spartans, to demonstrate Persian dominance. Instead, it had the opposite effect. The story spread throughout Greece. The great king had been so shaken by Leonidas and the 300 that he had violated all norms of warfare to desecrate the Spartan king's corpse. This made Leonidas a martyr and turned Thermopylae from a military defeat into a moral victory. The Persians had won the pass, but they had paid an enormous price. Ancient sources give wildly different casualty figures for the Persian army, ranging from a few thousand to 20,000. Modern historians tend toward the lower end of that range, estimating perhaps 4,000 to 6,000 Persian dead over the 3 days of battle. This might not seem like much given the size of Xerxes' army, but those casualties were concentrated among his best troops. The Immortals had suffered significant losses. Elite Persian infantry units had been mauled. These were not replaceable levies from distant provinces. These were professional warriors whose training and experience made them far more valuable than raw numbers suggested. More importantly, the psychological impact was devastating. The Persian army had been stopped for 3 full days by a force that should have been swept aside in hours. Every soldier in Xerxes' army now understood that Greek hoplites were extraordinarily dangerous opponents. The myth of Persian invincibility, carefully cultivated over decades of conquest, had been shattered in a narrow pass by 1,100 men who refused to retreat. The Persians buried their own dead, hauling bodies away from the pass for proper funeral rites, but there were too many. The ground was too rocky for mass graves. The summer heat accelerated decomposition. The stench of death hung over Thermopylae for weeks afterward, a permanent reminder of what had happened there. The Greek dead were left where they fell. The Persians made no effort to give them proper burial. This too became part of the legend. The Spartans and Thespians lay unburied in the pass, their bones picked clean by scavengers, a silent accusation against the massive army that had needed 3 days to overcome them. Xerxes, having finally cleared the pass, ordered his army to continue its march south, but the momentum of the invasion had been broken. The Greeks had proven they could resist. The Persian timetable had been disrupted. Most critically, The delay at Thermopylae had given the Greek fleet time to engage the Persian navy in the straits near Artemisium. The naval battle at Artemisium occurred simultaneously with the fighting at Thermopylae. The Greek fleet, composed primarily of Athenian triremes, fought the much larger Persian fleet to a standstill over 3 days of naval combat. Neither side achieved decisive victory, but the Greeks inflicted sufficient damage on Persian ships that the invasion's logistics became precarious. When news reached the Greek fleet that Thermopylae had fallen and Leonidas was dead, the Greek ships withdrew south, but they had accomplished their objective. They had contested Persian naval superiority and proven that the Persian fleet could be fought. The combination of Thermopylae on land and Artemisium at sea meant that Xerxes' invasion, while still advancing, was no longer the unstoppable juggernaut it had seemed. The Greeks had bought time. They had inflicted casualties. They had demonstrated that resistance was possible. Most importantly, they had given Greece something it desperately needed, a symbol of defiance. Aftermath and consequences. The Persian army continued its march south, but everything had changed. The easy surrenders and bloodless conquests of the early campaign were over. Greek cities that might have submitted now chose to fight. The wavering alliance of Greek city-states, which had seemed on the verge of collapse, found new resolve. Athens, in particular, was transformed by the news from Thermopylae. The Athenians had been debating whether to evacuate their city or to defend it. Many wanted to trust in their walls and hoped that the Persians would bypass them or accept negotiated surrender. The sacrifice of Leonidas and the 300 made such compromises impossible. How could Athens submit after Spartans had died to defend all of Greece? The Athenians voted to evacuate their city completely, moving the entire population to nearby islands and the Peloponnese. They would leave Athens empty for the Persians to occupy and burn, but they would preserve their fleet and their people to continue the fight. This was an extraordinary decision. The Athenians were abandoning everything, homes, temples, ancestral graves, based on faith that they could win a naval battle against the Persian fleet. Without Thermopylae, without the demonstration that Greeks could stand against the Persian army, this decision would have been unthinkable. Xerxes reached Athens in September of 480 BCE and found it nearly deserted. He burned the city, destroying the temples on the Acropolis and turning the lower city into ruins. But this was a hollow victory. The Athenian people were not there to subjugate. The Athenian fleet was intact and waiting. The decisive engagement of the Persian invasion came not on land, but at sea, in the narrow straits between the island of Salamis and the Athenian coast. The Greek fleet, led by the Athenian commander Themistocles, lured the Persian navy into confined waters, where superior numbers meant nothing. In those narrow straits, Greek triremes destroyed hundreds of Persian ships. The battle was a catastrophic defeat for Xerxes, eliminating his naval superiority and severing the supply lines his army depended on. After Salamis, Xerxes himself returned to Asia, leaving behind a large army under the command of Mardonius to continue the conquest. But the strategic initiative had shifted. The Greeks were no longer desperately defending, they were counterattacking. The following year, in 479 BCE, the combined Greek armies met Mardonius at Plataea in Boeotia. This time, the Greeks fielded a massive force, perhaps 40,000 hoplites, including the full Spartan army that had been held back during Thermopylae by religious festivals. The Battle of Plataea was a complete Greek victory. Mardonius was killed, his army destroyed or scattered. The Persian invasion of Greece was over. The strategic connection between Thermopylae and these later victories cannot be overstated. Without the delay at Thermopylae, the Persian army would have reached southern Greece weeks earlier. Athens would not have had time to evacuate. The Greek fleet would not have been ready. The Persian navy would have controlled the seas around Athens, making the evacuation impossible and the Battle of Salamis irrelevant. Thermopylae bought time. Not much time, only 3 days, but those 3 days were enough. Moreover, Thermopylae transformed Greek psychology. Before the battle, many Greeks believed the Persians were invincible. that resistance would only lead to harsher punishment when the inevitable conquest occurred. After Thermopylae, Greeks knew they could win. They had seen 300 Spartans and 700 Thespians hold the Persian army for 3 days and inflict thousands of casualties. If 1,100 men could do that, what could 40,000 do? The Spartans, for their part, were profoundly affected by Leonidas's death. The king who had not expected to rule, who had lived a quiet life as a warrior before fate placed him on the throne, became Sparta's greatest hero. His death elevated him to near mythical status. Spartans would speak of Thermopylae for centuries as the ultimate expression of their values: discipline, courage, obedience, and self-sacrifice. The 300 warriors who died with Leonidas were also honored. Their names were recorded and remembered. Monuments were erected in Sparta, listing each man who fell at Thermopylae. To have died at Thermopylae became the highest honor possible for a Spartan family. Descendants of the 300 enjoyed elevated social status for generations, but Sparta also honored the Thespians. The 700 men from that small city had stayed when they could have left. They had fought alongside the Spartans to the death. The Spartans, not known for praising anyone outside their own city, made an exception for Thespiae. The bond forged at Thermopylae between Spartans and Thespians lasted for generations, a reminder that courage and honor were not exclusive to Sparta. In the years after the Persian Wars, monuments were erected at Thermopylae. The most famous was a stone lion placed on the hill where Leonidas made his last stand. Beneath the lion, an inscription was carved, written by the poet Simonides. It read, "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here obedient to their laws, we lie." The epitaph is notable for what it emphasizes. It does not glorify individual heroism or martial prowess. It speaks of obedience to law. The Spartans died not because they were seeking glory, but because Spartan law required them to hold their position. They were doing their duty, nothing more and nothing less. This was the Spartan ideal distilled into a single sentence. Other monuments honored the Thespians and the total Greek force. The inscriptions acknowledged that men from multiple cities had fought and died at Thermopylae, though historical memory would eventually focus almost exclusively on the Spartans. This is somewhat unfair. The Thespians deserve equal honor, but understandable. The Spartans were already famous throughout Greece. Their presence at Thermopylae gave the battle an iconic quality it might not have had otherwise. The physical site of Thermopylae changed over subsequent centuries. Earthquakes altered the coastline. Sediment deposited by the Spercheios River gradually filled in the coastal plain, pushing the shoreline further north. Today, the site of the ancient battle is several miles inland from the sea. The narrow pass where the Greeks fought has been transformed by geology into a wide plain. Visitors to modern Thermopylae struggle to visualize how the ancient landscape made the defense possible, but the story survived the physical changes. Thermopylae became a cultural touchstone, referenced by historians, poets, and philosophers. It represented something essential about human nature: the refusal to submit to overwhelming force, the choice to stand even when standing is futile, the valuing of honor above survival. The battle also entered Persian consciousness, though less prominently. Persian records, to the extent they survived, treated Thermopylae as a minor delay, a small obstacle overcome on the path to the real objective. The Persians did not build monuments commemorating the battle or celebrate it as a great victory. For them, it was a frustration, a reminder that the conquest of Greece was far more expensive than anticipated. Greek writers used Thermopylae as a moral lesson. Herodotus, writing a generation after the battle, presented it as evidence of Greek superiority over Persian barbarism. He emphasized the contrast between free men fighting for their homeland and enslaved peoples fighting for their master's ambition. This interpretation is overly simplistic. Many Persian soldiers fought courageously, and many Greek cities submitted without resistance, but it shaped how Thermopylae was remembered. Later, Greek writers went even further, embellishing the story with increasingly fantastical elements. The numbers grew. Some accounts claimed that millions of Persians had been killed at Thermopylae. The Spartans became superhuman warriors, capable of killing dozens of enemies single-handedly. These exaggerations obscured the historical reality, but strengthened the mythological power of the story. Roman writers, inheriting Greek culture, also celebrated Thermopylae. Roman military theorists studied the battle as an example of how defensive terrain could neutralize numerical superiority. Roman moralists held up Leonidas as a model of virtuous leadership, a man who led from the front and chose death over dishonor. During the Roman period, Greek nationalists seeking to preserve Greek identity under imperial rule used Thermopylae as a symbol of Greek resistance to foreign domination. The irony that Sparta itself would eventually become part of the Roman Empire was apparently lost on them, or perhaps they found it poignant. In later European history, Thermopylae was repeatedly invoked as an example of heroic defense. Military commanders defending hopeless positions would compare themselves to Leonidas. Political leaders resisting superior force would reference the 300. The battle became a template, a story so powerful that it could be endlessly reinterpreted to fit new contexts. This mythologization had consequences. It created a cultural expectation that soldiers should fight to the death rather than surrender, even when surrender was the rational choice. It glorified suicidal stands and celebrated death over survival. Countless men died in subsequent wars because they believed they should emulate Leonidas, even when tactical retreat would have been wiser. The story also reinforced a militaristic ideal of masculinity that equated worth with willingness to die in combat. For Spartans, this was a coherent philosophy built into their entire social system. For other cultures that borrowed Spartan imagery without Spartan context, it created toxic expectations that harmed more than they helped. Yet for all its problematic elements, Thermopylae retains its power. The core narrative, a small group standing against impossible odds, choosing principle over survival, buying time for others through self-sacrifice, resonates across cultures and centuries. It speaks to something fundamental in the human spirit. The historical reality of Thermopylae is complex. The Persians were not cartoon villains bent on destroying freedom. They were building an empire using the standard imperial tools of their era: military conquest, diplomacy, and the incorporation of subject peoples into a larger political system. Many people lived perfectly satisfactory lives under Persian rule. Greek resistance was motivated as much by local politics and desire for independence as by abstract ideals of freedom. Similarly, the Spartans were not pure heroes. Their society was built on slavery and brutal oppression. The military excellence that allowed them to hold Thermopylae was purchased through systematic violence against the Helot population. Leonidas and his 300 were defending a social order that was, in many ways, profoundly unjust. But acknowledging these complexities does not diminish what happened at Thermopylae. 1,100 men held a narrow pass for 3 days against an army that vastly outnumbered them. They fought with extraordinary skill and courage. They inflicted disproportionate casualties on a seemingly invincible enemy, and they died to the last man rather than surrender or retreat. These are historical facts, independent of how we interpret their moral significance. The delay they achieved had strategic consequences that shaped the course of Western civilization. If Thermopylae had fallen on the first day, if the Persians had swept through central Greece before the Greeks could organize effective resistance, history would have been profoundly different. Persian conquest of Greece might have been permanent or, at least, longer-lasting. The development of Greek philosophy, drama, and democratic political theory, developments that occurred in the decades after the Persian Wars, might never have happened. The Roman Republic, which drew heavily on Greek culture, would have been fundamentally different. The entire trajectory of European and Middle Eastern history would have diverged. We cannot know for certain what would have happened in this alternate timeline. Historical counterfactuals are inherently speculative, but we can say with confidence that Thermopylae mattered. The battle had consequences that extended far beyond the 3 days of fighting in the pass. Why Thermopylae still matters. More than 2,000 years have passed since Leonidas and the 300 made their stand. The world they knew has vanished utterly. The Persian Empire fell to Alexander the Great a century and a half after Thermopylae. Sparta itself declined into irrelevance, its military system unable to adapt to changing warfare and its population unable to sustain constant losses. The Thespians, whose 700 warriors stood with the Spartans to the end, saw their city destroyed by the Thebans just decades later. The physical evidence of the battle is minimal. A few weapons and arrowheads, corroded by millennia, have been found in the general area. The monuments erected in antiquity have crumbled or been carted away. The landscape has changed so dramatically that standing on the modern site requires imagination to visualize how the ancient battle unfolded. Yet Thermopylae endures. The story has been retold in every century since it happened. It has been adapted, reinterpreted, sometimes distorted beyond recognition, but it survives. Why? The answer lies in what Thermopylae represents at a fundamental level. It is a story about choice, about men who understood they were going to die and chose to fight anyway, about the decision to stand when every rational calculation says to run, about the willingness to sacrifice everything for something larger than yourself. These themes are universal. Every human society understands the concept of sacrifice for the group. Every culture has stories of heroes who gave their lives so others could live. Thermopylae is one of the earliest and most dramatic examples of this archetype, preserved in detailed historical accounts that ground the myth in concrete reality. But Thermopylae is also about something more specific: the power of discipline and organization to overcome raw force. The Spartans did not win at Thermopylae through superhuman strength or divine intervention. They won, to the extent they won at all, through training, coordination, and tactics. They understood that a small group of men fighting intelligently could achieve results that seemed impossible. This is why military theorists still study Thermopylae. The specific tactics are ancient, but the principles remain relevant. Use terrain to your advantage. Maintain unit cohesion. Choose defensive positions that neutralize enemy strengths. Force the enemy to fight on your terms rather than theirs. These lessons are as applicable today as they were in 480 BCE. Thermopylae also demonstrates the psychological dimensions of warfare. Xerxes had every material advantage. He commanded vastly superior numbers, better logistics, more resources. He should have swept the Greeks aside effortlessly. Instead, he was delayed for 3 days and forced to commit his elite troops to take a position held by a tiny force. Why? Because the Greeks refused to be intimidated. They did not fight as though they were outmatched. They fought as though victory was assured, and that confidence was infectious. Each time the Persians attacked and were repulsed, their confidence eroded slightly. Each casualty made the next attack harder psychologically. The Persians began to doubt themselves, and doubt is fatal in combat. Conversely, every hour the Greeks held increased their own morale and the morale of Greeks throughout Hellas. The message was clear. The Persians could be stopped. The enormous army that had seemed invincible could be fought. This psychological shift was worth more than any tactical advantage. In modern times, Thermopylae has been invoked in contexts far removed from ancient Greek warfare. During World War II, defenders of various hopeless positions compared themselves to Leonidas and the 300. Some of these comparisons were apt, small forces defending critical positions against overwhelming odds. Others were cynical propaganda used by leaders to convince soldiers to die in battles that served no strategic purpose. The danger of Thermopylae as a cultural model is precisely this potential for exploitation. The story glorifies death in battle, and throughout history, leaders have used that glorification to send men to their deaths unnecessarily. Not every defensive position is worth dying for. Not every last stand serves a meaningful purpose. The fact that Thermopylae achieved important strategic objectives does not mean that all such sacrifices will do the same. Yet the story persists because it speaks to something genuine. There are moments when retreat is not an option. When the only choice is between fighting and submission, when standing, even knowing you will die, is the only way to preserve something essential, whether that is your comrades' lives, your society's freedom, or your own sense of honor. The Spartans at Thermopylae were not perfect heroes. They were products of a brutal, militaristic society built on slavery. They fought to preserve a social order that deserves moral criticism. But within the context of their time and place, they made a choice that matters. They chose the hard path. They chose duty over survival. They chose to be the shield that bought their people time to prepare for the storm. Thermopylae reminds us that numbers are not everything, that discipline and training can overcome raw strength, that a few determined individuals can change the course of history, that sometimes the right thing to do is to stand and fight even when victory is impossible. These lessons are powerful. They are also dangerous if applied carelessly. The story of Thermopylae should not be used to justify mindless sacrifice or to glorify war, but it should be remembered as an example of what humans can achieve when they commit fully to a cause larger than themselves. The 300 Spartans who marched to Thermopylae knew they would not return. They went anyway. They held the pass for 3 days against the largest army ever assembled. They inflicted thousands of casualties on an empire that thought itself invincible. They bought Greece the time it needed to survive, and they created a legend that has inspired people for more than 2 millennia. That is why Thermopylae still matters, not because the Spartans were perfect, not because the battle was the greatest military achievement in history, but because it demonstrates what becomes possible when human beings refuse to accept the inevitable. Leonidas and the 300 stood in a narrow pass and told the Persian Empire, "You shall not pass," and for 3 days the empire could not pass. When it finally did, it had been transformed from an unstoppable force into an army that could be defeated. That transformation changed the world. It preserved Greek independence long enough for Greek culture to develop and spread. It allowed the emergence of Athenian democracy, of Greek philosophy, of the cultural achievements that became the foundation of Western civilization. We cannot know what would have happened if Leonidas had retreated. Perhaps Athens would have fallen sooner. Perhaps the Greek fleet would have been scattered before it could fight at Salamis. Perhaps the Persian Empire would have conquered Greece permanently, and the history of Europe and the Mediterranean would have been completely different. Or perhaps the Greeks would have found another way to resist. Perhaps Athens would have organized its defense regardless. Perhaps the Battle of Salamis would have happened anyway. Historical causation is complex, and single events rarely determine outcomes absolutely. But we do know this. Leonidas chose to stand. His Spartans chose to fight. The Thespians chose to die beside them. And their choice mattered. They held the hot gates for 3 days. They showed the Greek world that Persians could bleed. They demonstrated that courage and discipline could stand against overwhelming odds. They bought time for Greece to survive. And they left us a story that reminds us, 25 centuries later, that sometimes the right choice is to stand, to fight, to refuse submission even when defeat is certain. Not because standing guarantees victory, but because some things matter more than survival. Because honor and duty and the welfare of those who depend on you can outweigh the instinct for self-preservation. Because sometimes the only way to win is to be willing to lose everything. That is the lesson of Thermopylae. Not that we should seek death in battle, not that war is glorious or noble, but that when the moment comes, when everything is on the line, when retreat means abandonment of everything you value, some people will stand. 300 Spartans stood, 700 Thespians stood, 1,100 men in a narrow pass against an empire. They lost, and in losing, they won something far greater than victory in battle. They won immortality. Not for themselves as individuals, but for what they represented, the human capacity to choose courage over fear, duty over safety, sacrifice over survival. That choice echoes through history. It inspired the Greeks who defeated Persia at Salamis and Plataea. It inspired later generations facing their own impossible odds. It continues to inspire today whenever people face overwhelming, force and must decide whether to submit or to stand. Thermopylae is not about war, it is about will, about the moment when everything is stripped away except the choice between who you want to be and what you are willing to endure to be that person. Leonidas and his 300 made their choice. They stood in the hot gates and fought until the end. They held back the largest army in the ancient world for 3 days with 1,100 men. It should have been impossible. But they did it anyway, and that is why, more than 2,000 years later, we still tell the story. Because sometimes impossible is just another word for necessary, and sometimes 300 men can change the world.